Go Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Ming of Revolution. Israel will not forgive Trump for not nuking Iran. We got to be careful for the terrorism, y'all. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform. Israel won't accept defeat. They don't like what happened to them. The media blackout still going on, and they probably want something to happen on July 4th so Americans will get back into that fight with them. But we got to look into the truth. What actually happened to Israel?
Well, once again, here's a sanitized version of a video I was trying to do. So I guess I'll leave this whole bit out. You can read.
Now, this is a list on the screen. All the military sites that were hit, the most important sites that were destroyed in Israel. Total media blackout. They don't want to talk about this. It's a reason why Trump was forced into trying to call for a ceasefire, because Israel was collapsing and all the top facilities were hit.
That's a lot of critical infrastructure that is offline now. But let me ask you this. If things were actually going well for them, do you think they would have stopped? Yeah, me neither. So here was the other part of the video, if this doesn't need 24-hour additional review. Now, for the record, I was the only person I know of on YouTube that didn't just automatically run with their story. I said, no, wait a minute. This has setup written all over it. See, this was 2 weeks ago, right after it happened. And here's a clip from that and where I was at that time. And to me, this looks like a very possible flag here. As of right now, I'd probably give it a 50-50 chance. This is the second time in a month that Blumpf has been in negotiations with a head of state, and then things started going kablooey everywhere. This absolutely destroys any adversary's confidence in anything Trump says. And this is actually the perfect setup, because what's Blumpf going to do? Come out and say, well, I had no idea this was going to happen, and look stupid? Or he can say, well, I told him not to, and then look weak. But he released this statement at like 3 a.m. So they were up all night trying to figure out how to frame it. So I was about 50-50 at the time. Now I'm about 90-10 that they flagged this. Even WAPO reported that the Yeezy prime minister had set in motion plans to go after Persia long before Blumpf began efforts to resolve concerns. In the fall of last year, long before Blumpf came along, Benji had already set Yeezy on the road to conflict. Throughout the fall, they had met with JoJo's administration to discuss intelligence and tactics. And just read what it says here. It says that their scientists were gathering to resume theoretical research. Theoretical, all in the mind, not physical research. So they had zero intel of any physical activity going on. So they started offing scientists. So this would be no different than the Germansies taking out Albert Einstein in WW3. Those usually aren't considered enemy combatants, but that's how cold-blooded these people operate. But U.S. intelligence never concluded that they had even made the decision to do the theoretical research. So it was all a trust me, bro. In private conversations, senior officials said they had already decided by March, weeks before the meeting here in Washington, that they were going to strike Persia with or without U.S. participation by June at the latest. So let me just put the whole story into context, easy to understand. Blumpf actually did explain exactly what was going on. He had an agreement with Benji that they had 60 days to negotiate a truce. And then on day 63, they went ahead with this plan that had already been decided last March. So yes, Trump did have prior knowledge that this was most likely going to come. Only I'm guessing that he thought that they'd give him more than 3 days over the deadline like a decent human being, but that's not what we're dealing with here. So after that first strike, he really had no choice but to say, well, I told them they needed to sign on the dotted line or bad things were going to happen. That doesn't mean that it was his intention for any of this to happen. And if you've ever had a friend that likes getting everybody around them into a fight along with them, then you know what this is like. No, I'm just going to talk to them. Bop. Oh, crap. So then, like I said 2 weeks ago, what's Blumpf going to do? Say, no, I had no idea this was coming and look stupid? Or is he going to say, well, I was telling them to wait and they went ahead without me and then look weak? It really was the perfect setup where Blumpf really had no choice but to play along, at least in part. And then Yeezy intelligence went to the press immediately after saying, oh, yeah, it was a big deception plan to get them to let their guard down. Tucker Carlson even came out and said, look, I know the people that were working on this project, doing the paperwork, doing the footwork, and they were 100% trying to negotiate a deal here. And once again, here they confirmed that these plans had been set into motion months and years before they were executed. In an interview on Tuesday, Benji said that he had decided on the exact timing of this only 2 weeks earlier, but that had made the, quote, difficult decision to carry out the operation several months ago. So he had decided to go through with this with or without Blumpf, and I still maintain that it was without Blumpf. He just went ahead and did it, knowing America would be over a barrel about it. And the fact of the matter is the only way they could have toppled the leadership was with America's help. What, do you think Turkey, Syria, or Iraq would, or Saudi Arabia for that matter, would have allowed Yeezy to send a bunch of troops over there to start a land invasion? Not a chance in hell. Also, Yeezy doesn't have the Air Force strength to actually go do anything either. The U.S. has had several agreements to go to their defense ever since 1952. And I will bet you one of the conditions in there is a nuclear threat from anybody. So really the path of least resistance here was just to go over, drop some heavy ordnance on the nuclear facilities, and then say, okay, we've done what we're contractually obligated to do. Have fun with it. What they weren't expecting was how effective Persia's offense was going to be. So after just 12 days, they had to call it quits. This was a big psychological grind on the people that live in these cities because every 4 to 6 hours, you're not even getting a good night's sleep. You got to get up, go down to the shelter. Now, here's my bad news prediction about this is I don't think it's over. Yeezy has literally done tens of thousands of violations of these agreements. So right now they're reloading, restocking, but I don't think they're going to be that quick to jump in the ring this time. I only heard of 1 or 2 instances that haven't been confirmed yet where Persia actually launched any of their hypersonics. So they actually did all of this with outdated stock, and it was incredibly effective. So as soon as they get restocked, they're going to want to try again. But now they've already played their trump card, as it were. They're not going to be able to trick U.S. into this. That doesn't mean that they can't buy our way into it into the future.
How about tricking the U.S.? It's about these Iranian sleeper cells that they're saying is all over America. And they're arresting them and they want death to America. It's about the Zionist small hats committing an act of terror and just convincing people to go along with their war on Iran. Hell no, they're not going to sit back and allow what just happened to them.
But they're not going to entrap anybody on a clause in a defense contract, which was basically what they were trying to do. It was probably something along the lines, well, since they've got an enrichment program, they could be close to having the big kablooey, and under Section 808(3)(c), then you're obligated to defend us. And by going in and hitting these 3 sites, then Blumpf can say, well, I did what I was required to do. So you kids have fun out there. A couple things about this is I heard it was
the people in the U.S. intelligence that's exposed. That's why Trump and the Secretary of Defense, the Christian Crusader, young punk, headset, or whatever his name is. That's why they were so pissed, because it's the small hats that's inside our government that exposed Trump was lying. Remember, Trump came out and said, we totally destroyed it. The nuclear program is through. We won. USA. Then the people came out one of their intel things, said, well, no, our preliminary findings is that it's okay, it's intact, not much damage. That's them. Then they come out and say, Iran is a couple of months away from a nuclear weapon. That's them trying to force the U.S. hand, say, Trump, you lied. We got to go to war. Iran might kill us. It's disgusting. But see, Trump, he should never played footsies with the devil. They're going to drag. See, they got to get the U.S. They don't give a fuck how many United States citizens get killed. They got to get the U.S. into that war with Iran. They don't care at what it costs. They can't let the Iranian nation survive with that type of power, that military power they just showed the world.
It's war gamed like a couple years back under JoJo, and that doesn't surprise me in the least. You generally still have the same military leaders throughout different administrations, and this has always been a high value target. I mean, Benji's been trying to get us to do this for 20 years. Another thing was the debate about whether or not this was effective. Well, I watched some videos on these bunker busters, and some of them were saying it could go 200 feet into solid rock. I seriously doubt that. Of course, they overstate their capabilities all the time. But just like they did in Berlin, you can drop one after another, and it's going to dig down to the bunker. Something else people were saying is it doesn't look like much damage on the surface. Well, if it did work and it buried itself, 50, 100 feet into the ground, then it's all just going to collapse in on itself and not look like a whole lot. But I really don't think its effectiveness matters too much here. I mean, this was just pretty much theater. Bluff can just say, I did my part, prove me wrong. This and the retaliation could have been pre-agreed upon between Bluff and Persia. You tell them, hey, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Get your people out. I'm going to come in and take out this facility, and then you can lob a couple over at our base. We'll call it good. Or I've got all of Congress and the mainstream media itching for a fight here. So we can do one run tomorrow or 1,000 runs over the next year. One thing I'm definitely not buying is they know exactly where all the yellow cake is. They know whether it was in there or not, which I'm 90% sure it wasn't. But the U.S. has balloons up all the time that can detect a very minuscule amount from a long ways away. So they know if that moved or not. Anyway, that's the way I see things. I'll catch you guys on the next one. Static out.
Space program has been making impressive strides.
They've never played by the rules. They don't see us as a competitor. They see us as an enemy.
Are the American systems not visible because the U.S. constellation is smaller than BeiDou's?
Welcome to GBS Deep Dive. I'm Najma Minhas. And today we're breaking down a quiet but powerful shift that could reshape the future of global navigation systems and how it impacts wars going forward. Now, in the midst of the Israeli-Iran war last week, a decision was made by the Iranian leadership, which was missed by many people. Iran made a strategic move in which it disabled the GPS across its territory and formally adopted China's BeiDou satellite navigation system. Now, it wasn't a tech upgrade. It was a clear geopolitical statement. And it's a decision that's expected to serve it well in the future as well, especially given that it's believed that the ceasefire has only been agreed by Israel to let it consolidate itself before starting the next offense. For decades, the GPS, which was built and controlled by the United States military, has been the backbone of satellite navigation technology for global positioning, navigation, and timing. But for countries like Iran, long at odds with Washington, relying on United States infrastructure comes with real risks, from the threat of service blackouts to surveillance and cyber vulnerabilities. So why now? Several reasons likely pushed Iran towards this decisive shift. First, with the rising threats of cyber warfare and electronic jamming, especially during a period of heightened tensions with Israel and the United States, Iran could no longer afford to rely on a system its adversaries can disrupt. Second, China's BeiDou offers not only technical superiority in some domains, but also geostrategic alignment. Beijing and Tehran are deepening ties across trade, energy, and defense. Third, this is part of a larger Iranian strategy to break dependence on Western-dominated systems, whether it's SWIFT, the internet, or satellite networks. But there is a key reason this move came now: a scandal which brewed inside Iran's war rooms. Iranian state media claimed that WhatsApp and Instagram had leaked the real-time locations of senior Iranian officials to foreign powers, particularly Israel and the United States. These apps, they alleged, broadcasted location data whenever phones were connected to the internet, a digital breadcrumb trail for hostile drones and missiles. While Meta, the parent company of WhatsApp and Instagram, owned by Mark Zuckerberg, has denied these allegations, insisting it doesn't collect or share precise location data and uses end-to-end encryption. Cybersecurity analysts say that the risk isn't in the message content, it's in the metadata, in the timestamps, communication frequency, and even approximate GPS data can be exploited, especially if spyware is involved. In response, Iran urged its citizens across the country, 90 million people, to delete WhatsApp and Instagram altogether, calling them tools of espionage. Now, this isn't just about paranoia. Some of Iran's most high-profile military assassinations, including those that happened during this current conflict, are now being traced back to potential leaks from digital communications. The country went on to lock down its internet for the same reason. Reports show that during June 2025 war escalation, the government blocked internet access by over 97%. Including social and messaging apps. Despite WhatsApp's statement, the company has recently got another shock, as a couple of days ago, the United States House of Representatives also banned WhatsApp on all its members' devices. The notice to all House staff said that the Office of Cybersecurity has deemed WhatsApp a high risk to users due to the lack of transparency in how it protects user data, absence of stored data encryption, and potential security risks involved with its use. This goes far beyond digital surveillance. What you're about to hear is how GPS became one of the most powerful tools in US hands, and why China decided to quietly challenge that supremacy in space. BeiDou isn't just a replacement, it's a serious competitor to the GPS in the current environment, the geopolitics of which is encouraging a full divergence in technology systems between China, Russia, potentially some of the BRICS nations or the Global South, and the West. With a full constellation of global satellites, is delivering high accurate positioning, robust anti-jamming protections, and even a unique short message communication feature. Now, that last one is particularly important, especially in areas where traditional networks fail. Think of war zones, remote areas, or natural disasters. On the technological front, Iran gets access to precise navigation for civilian industries, from trucking and farming to telecom. Strategically, this is about sovereignty. Iran is signaling that it will no longer be vulnerable to American control over its critical infrastructure. And on a global scale, BeiDou is gaining momentum. Iran's move shows how China's system is not just a backup. It's becoming a first-choice alternative for countries who are seeking political independence. Please stay with me to the end to understand how GPS became our indispensable daily tool. Most of us would now be redundant without it. Are map reading skills even taught in schools any longer? Why the Chinese realize that the power that controls space controls the battlefield. How China's BeiDou stands relative to the United States GPS. And finally, how China will silently end up helping Iran in any future war. To truly understand this shift, we need to go back to how GPS became such a dominant force. It all started in the Cold War. When the Soviets launched the Sputnik in 1957, United States scientists discovered they could track its radio signal from the ground using the Doppler effect. And that led to the United States Navy building Transit, the first satellite navigation system for submarines in the 1960s. By 1973, the United States Department of Defense launched Navstar GPS, a unified military control system designed for global coverage. It used 24 satellites in orbit, controlled from ground stations, and offered 24/7 positioning, navigation, and timing. In 1983, after the Korean Air Flight 007 was shot down near Soviet airspace, President Ronald Reagan announced that GPS would be available to civilians, but with a signal degradation, so that it would not be as precise for civilians as it was for the military. Now, this was done for security reasons, obviously. It wasn't until 1995 that GPS reached full global functionality. But in 2000, President Clinton ended signal degradation. He unlocked high precision for civilian access. This was a turning point that's fueled everything from smartphones and Uber to precision agriculture and warfare. Now, that's when everyday life started to change for all of us. By the late 2000s, people everywhere from Europe to Asia were relying on United States satellites. No more printing MapQuest directions. I don't know how many of you remember doing that or wrestling with folded maps in the car. For those of you who remember driving and the fights in the car, you missed that turn, go back. Why didn't you tell me I had to turn over there? GPS has probably saved a lot of relationships. By the late 2000s, with smartphones in our pockets, GPS became personal. GPS didn't just reshape warfare, it reshaped how we live our lives, how we move, how we communicate. However, it quietly also gave the United States an invisible hand in our daily lives, the lives of billions of people around the world. But behind that convenience was a deeper dependency. Whether you were delivering rice in Pakistan or guiding a ship in the South China Sea, you were using a system that the United States could turn off at any time. It drove trillions of dollars of activity worldwide. One 2024 study has estimated that one day outage of the GPS system would cost the United States alone $1.6 billion per day. Today, the GPS is run by the United States Space Force, and it's in the third generation, GPS 3. So it features stronger encryption and better jamming resistance. But remember, it's still under the United States military control. In a conflict, access can be cut. While GPS was once the undisputed king of sat-nav and a key instrument of American soft power, it now has a growing list of global navigation satellite system competitors. From China's BeiDou to the European Union's Galileo, Russia's GLONASS, and even India's regional system, the NAV-IC. However, without question, the most significant rivalry comes from China. China learned that lesson early. After watching United States forces dominate the Gulf War in 1991 with GPS-guided strikes, Chinese military leaders concluded that they needed their own system. But the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis is widely regarded as that key triggering event that pushed China to begin developing its own satellite navigation system, what would eventually become BeiDou. In 1996, in response to the pro-independence moves and the first democratic elections in Taiwan, China conducted a series of missile tests near Taiwanese ports. The US reacted by deploying 2 aircraft carrier strike groups to the Taiwan Straits. It was a clear signal to Beijing, back down. During that standoff, China realized that its military was blind compared to US forces, which used GPS to coordinate naval and air assets with precision. It also realized that it relied entirely on the GPS, which the United States could cut off or degrade at any moment. In 1997, formal approval was granted to begin the BeiDou program. BeiDou 1 was launched in 2000 with just 3 satellites and some small regional coverage. BeiDou 2 followed in 2012, expanding its services across the Asia-Pacific. But it was BeiDou 3, which was completed in 2020, that gave China full global satellite navigation capability. Now, this system now has over 30 satellites and rivals GPS in many areas of the world. Overall, BeiDou now has around 45 to 50 operational satellites as compared to the United States GPS, which has 31. Now, what further enhances BeiDou's power? The Chinese have many more ground stations than GPS. This is what helps to amplify and strengthen the signal even more. BeiDou's civilian service offers a much better positioning accuracy of around 1 meter in many parts of Asia and China, as well as parts of Africa, while GPS typically in those areas provides accuracy within 3 to 5 meters. While globally, BeiDou is said to have around 2.5 to 5 meters, which is similar to that of the GPS. Although some reports suggest that it outdoes GPS accuracy in over 165 countries. In simple terms, have you tried sending someone your current location? What pops up and tells you how close in meters it gets to where you are? Now, if you see mine on the screen when I was doing this, I made all the areas black for, security reasons. But you can see that the GPS in my area where I was at that point gets as close as 5 meters accuracy to where I was sitting at that time. Now, most phones support all global navigation systems out there, but generally what phones will do is they'll tap into any of the satellites that is closest to it and is giving it the best signal. But this isn't just about satellite counts. It's about who controls the infrastructure of war, trade, and everyday life, and what happens when that control quietly shifts. For military applications, it is said that BeiDou can achieve centimeter-level accuracy, and it offers encrypted military channels as well as that short message function that lets users send text or location data without cell coverage. Now, that is critical for emergencies as well as battlefield scenarios. That is a unique strategic capability, something that GPS still does not offer. BeiDou now powers over 1.5 billion users worldwide daily. From smartphones and smart cities in China and Pakistan to logistic hubs in Africa, it's being used over the 140 countries, especially those under the BRI program. BeiDou is quietly becoming the backbone of the new tech ecosystem. It's a central pillar in China's Belt and Road Initiative, linking infrastructure with digital sovereignty. Over 30 countries in Africa are using it for precision agriculture, which has helped those countries to boost their yields by over 15%. And in war, BeiDou gives China and its allies, like Iran, a GPS-independent strike and defense capability within seconds precision. So when Iran shuts off GPS and turns on BeiDou, it's not just a software update. It's a geopolitical realignment. If BeiDou keeps rising, we may be watching the decline of America's uncontested digital empire. GPS is lagging in updates as per the United States' own Space Force Department. The US is currently replacing its 1990s era GPS satellites with newer GPS-3 satellites. However, those GPS-3 are still not trailblazing technology. They were originally intended to launch in 2014. Now, these satellites offer only a moderate improvement to the last GPS version. They just give a little bit of an upgraded accuracy, going from 3 meters down to 1 meters. This is less than what Galileo can already provide. GPS is expected to be followed by what is called GPS 3F. Now, that's expected to provide additional capabilities, such as that first completely digital navigation payload. However, this GPS 3F is not expected to take place until the mid-2030s. By 2035, China's aiming to make BeiDou the world's go-to system. Now, that's not without its own issues. Unlike, for example, the European strict GDPR laws for data provision, China doesn't have any such thing. Now, coming back to Iran, China's BeiDou satellite navigation system offers Iran a strategic upgrade at a time when the Western-controlled infrastructure is both a security threat and a geopolitical liability for the country. By shifting to BeiDou, Iran gains access to a secure, independent navigation network that cannot be degraded or cut off by the United States, unlike the GPS system. Now, this has immediate military implications, as you can imagine. Iranian drones, missiles, and air defense systems can now operate with enhanced precision using BeiDou's encrypted coordinates. The system's advanced anti-jamming capabilities and even that unique short message function, which allows limited text communications without cellular network, means that Iran on the battlefield gets much better resilience, especially in the event of any cyber attacks or electronic warfare being used. In a future conflict with Israel or during a regional escalation in the Gulf, these features could provide decisive, allowing Iranian forces to coordinate, navigate, and strike targets without relying on vulnerable United States-linked systems. Beyond the battlefield, BeiDou also strengthens Iran's civilian logistics and economic survival under the sanctions. Iranian oil tankers, cargo fleets, and overland trade convoys, they can now navigate using BeiDou instead of GPS, which helps Tehran to reduce its exposure to Western tracking and surveillance, especially through the so-called dark fleet tactics that rely on disabling transponders and avoiding detection. China's integration of BeiDou into its Belt and Road infrastructure also gives Iran a foothold in the Eurasian trade corridors. It deepens its connectivity through Central Asia and the Caspian region. Symbolically, Iran's adoption of BeiDou signals a technological realignment, a quiet but firm pivot away from Western digital hegemony and towards a China-led alternative order, where sovereignty is maintained not only through missiles and treaties, but also through satellite signals and code. Share with me your thoughts. Do you think more countries will follow?
How many days we have left for this?
Just today and tomorrow.
That's it. 2 more days. So you've been seeing our faces every day. So
well, kind of a lot's going on. And today we are diving into
China and Russia and everything else. They're combined. There's so many moving parts. So we're gonna start. We'll start with China, at least to a degree. Then we'll move into what the U.S. Department of Defense just stated, because it's just so many moving parts. So,
absolutely.
We'll start with that first.
So the Defense Department thing is very interesting because there's kind of a battle right now going on between what Donald Trump is saying happened in terms of the bombing of the nuclear facilities, and then what
the reality is.
Intelligence. I'm not going to posit to know what reality is, but the Defense Department or the intelligence services basically put out this report. The White House said, yes, the report exists. We just don't agree with it. So interesting.
Yeah. Then we'll start with that and dive into that first. Then we'll continue our conversation. So what did I'm assuming you saw the press conference by the Secretary of Defense.
Yes. Okay. So we have a couple of moving parts, but before we do that, let's jump into our sponsor, because big thank you to our sponsor, because without them, this would not be possible. So thank you to them.
Let's do that. Yeah.
A big thank you to today's show sponsor, Giant Mining Corp. Without our sponsors, this show wouldn't be possible. Copper shortages just went political. Washington's eyeing import tariffs, and the scramble for homegrown supply is on. Prices are brushing $4.85 a pound, while global stockpiles sit at a 15-year lows. Enter Giant Mining Corp, advancing the 9,800-acre Majuba Hill project in mining Red, Nevada. Recent drilling cut a 170-foot zone averaging 0.4% copper, crowned by a 10-foot streak at 4.4% grades that the majors pay billions for. Independent engineers at RASPC are already modeling the first resource estimates. So Majuba moves while rivals wrestle with the new red tape. Speed wins the super cycle, and they are built for speed. Dig deeper at giantminingcorp.com or on the OTC at BFGFF in the US and BFG in Canada. Remember, there are always risks in investments, and there are no guarantees of any kind.
Oh, sorry, guys. I took us off.
Thank you to our sponsor. So,
yes. Okay, David, do you want to dive into China first, Russia first, or the...
Either, or let's talk about the US. Let's talk about the Department of Defense. Because that seems to really take precedence, because the information just came out as of yesterday afternoon, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me show. So, I have the actual CNN report. So I do think it's, CNN is traditionally the left-wing media, right? And so the left-wing media is going to be very anti-Trump. So I really want to take all of this sort of in a greater context, because it's not like we trust the legacy media. It's not like we're like, oh yeah, CNN is the absolute best. And no, absolutely not. Both sides take both the right and the left, especially in the mainstream media, take whatever information they can to try and use it against the other side, regardless of whether it's true or not. However, I have heard more or less this same information come out of, for example, oh my gosh, what is his name? So some of the other top voices, Scott Ritter, for example, said something very, very similar to this. So it's coming out of some of the cooler heads and more even-keeled voices. So basically it's this. Let me share the screen with you guys. Here it is. Okay. So,
wow.
So the U.S. So this is from CNN. Like I said, guys, take everything with a grain of salt. Be skeptical about everything. The U.S. military strikes on 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities last weekend did not destroy the core components of the country's nuclear program and likely only set it back by months, according to an early U.S. intelligence assessment that was described by 4 people briefed on it. The assessment, which has not been previously reported, was produced by the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon's intelligence arm. Now, remember, the White House says this is a real report. It's just that they don't agree with the report, but they did agree that it was real.
Yeah.
It's based on battle damage assessment conducted by U.S. Central Command. I mean, okay, in the aftermath of the U.S. strikes, one of the sources said, the analysis of the damage to the sites and the impact of the strikes on Iran's nuclear ambition is ongoing. It could change as more intelligence becomes available, but the early findings are at odds with President Donald Trump's repeated claims that the strikes completely and totally obliterated Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth also said on Sunday that Iran's nuclear ambitions have been obliterated. I wonder if that's true.
Yeah.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told CNN in a statement, this alleged assessment is flat out wrong and was classified as top secret. Okay, so they're agreeing that it exists.
Yeah.
But was still leaked to CNN by an anonymous low-level loser in the intelligence community. The leaking of this alleged assessment is a clear attempt to demean President Trump. That is for sure true. That's definitely not wrong. And discredit, okay, this is where, like, if people, just linguistically, guys, if people try and say something like what she's about to say, someone is lying. And discredit the brave fighter pilots who, I mean, of course they're brave fighter pilots. I'm sure that they are extremely brave and wonderful at their jobs. However, that's linguistically curious, who conducted a perfectly executed mission to obliterate Iran's nuclear program. Everyone knows what happens when you drop 14 30,000-pound bombs perfectly on their target's total obliteration.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when they said somebody leaked information, that is a normal practice inside the government. And I tell you this as one who was in Washington and was aware of those kind of leaks. You know, it comes from both parties. Let's just make this clear. Of course, the CNN, knowing how it is, which nobody should even trust any media in the US, Fox or whomever, NBC, ABC, all of them, all the media stuff, there is nothing to learn from. All it is there is to mislead the consumer. So basically, when you hear or read something like this, it's for domestic consumptions to keep the narrative alive. The idea that the US has obliterated the Iran's nuclear program is nonsense, because here is the thing. As of this morning, our time, which was yesterday afternoon, Iran made a decision. It's still going to have, it's pending by the final approval of the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, which, as I predicted, and there is on a record, I did mention that, if you see the sign that Iran will cease its cooperation with the IAEA, that means they are going to be speeding up the process for nuclear bomb per se. So as of today, the cooperation with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which, by the way, cooked up the intelligence in coordination with the US and said that Iran has enriched uranium beyond the level that has been agreed on, which was a lie. IAEA, Grossi, his name is Grossi, the head of the IAEA, is as corrupted as it gets. So that's why I'm saying, guys, pay attention to what you are listening to from different sources. What we provide in you is information to the best of our abilities, as accurate as it gets. And we do this, we've been doing this since we started. We fact check the information. We make sure that it is as accurate as it gets. So do we miss sometimes? Yes, of course. We are just humans like everybody else. But suffice it to say, for the Trump administration to say, well, we obliterated the nuclear program, it's flat out lie, because here is the harsh truth. And the truth is, now Israel is almost begging Iran to stop the missile launching. Because like I said earlier, it's not that the Iran's going to be launching ICBMs here at the US. They won't do that. They don't have the capabilities for all that. So what they have is the capabilities to target Iran and anything else in the region. Well, Israel is experiencing now that the wrath of the Iranians, because they didn't expect it. For us, Trump didn't realize that he did bite more than he can chew off.
Well, so I have this sort of as a, it's still a question, because David, you're right. We do the absolute best we can, but we're not in those rooms, right? We're not the ones making the decisions, and nobody is informing us on anything, right? And so we're doing the absolute best we can with what we have. But so I'm overall very curious as to what the issue is here. Why did, because we see these intelligence leaks, like you said, all the time. So what was the purpose of leaking this intelligence? Who leaked it and why? Because there's a reason. The plenty of things happen that aren't leaked probably most things aren't leaked, but this is such a hot topic.
Yeah.
And President Trump has been pushing it so hard that it was like such a success. And, you know, it's been actually interesting. I will say this. I don't think he's handled very much correctly. And I'm not sure that he has here either. But I will say he does seem to be pushing the like, this is over, guys. This is over. This is over. This is over. Like trying to almost will it into existence, right? Like if he says it enough, then it's going to be over. And so I assume that it wouldn't actually be over. I assume back channels would continue to sort of work this through. But it's interesting that this is a reason to open this back up. This is a reason to continue this type of conflict. And so I don't know that this intelligence leak was leaked for the good of humanity. So I always look at what could there be a motivation for on the other side. And David, what do you think about, you know, this? And we'll get to Russia and China in a minute, guys, because we only have a few more minutes. So, but this type of intelligence leak, and now it's being absolutely blown everywhere. There seems like there's something else going on here, something that's not quite on the surface. What do you think?
What the one on the surface is that they, meaning they, in this case, US and Israel, didn't expect the response from Iran. That is what's at the heart of it. And of course, they miscalculated, thinking they're going to intimidate Iran by dropping the bombs and all that stuff. You know, it's once again, it gives me a clear indication that they, meaning Israel and US in this case, or the policymakers who decided on this, had no clue about the history of the Persian Empire. So when you have intelligence like this that is being cooked up, and this is not the first time, you know, if I am to take you back to 9/11 forward, then
absolutely,
or even before that, go back to 1967 when the Israel attacked the USS Liberty, and how the intelligence was cooked up. So it's the norm here in the American administration. That's why no president whatsoever is decent enough. Yeah, you get one or two. If I am to think about Jimmy Carter, was trying to do the right thing, but he wasn't allowed to anyway. The rest of them are all crooks. That's just the reality we have in the US. That's why who you're gonna vote for? You know, Americans.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, Americans got shocked. Excuse me, I'm coming down with a cold, guys.
I know, that's why we only have a few more minutes, because David is coming down with a cold. So
surprising. I don't get cold usually, but
well, a lot of travel will do that. I mean, it's very
so the idea that the intelligence being cooked up, it's a normal practice, and that put the whole intelligence community and sort of under the microscope. You know, you would expect the intelligence community to do sort of provide an objective assessment. Not anymore, including the three-letter agency. It lost, and speaking of the agency, they just lost about 20 spies in China. They disappeared. Makes you just wonder.
Disappeared. I wonder where they went.
That's correct. Yeah. So the idea that what Trump is trying to do, they're trying to minimize the damage. And that damage is, you know, we have blown up the Iran nuclear program, no more and all that. No, it's flat out lie. And now that Iran, as I mentioned earlier, suspended the cooperation with the IAEA, and rightly so. I was just wondering when they're going to do that. Because it's exactly what North Korea and Pakistan, Pakistan did. And look, can we now go and threaten North Korea? Can we go and threaten Pakistan?
No, we can't, and we don't.
I don't think so. That's the same thing. And it's going to become, because moving forward, if I am to think the next 20 years, Iran will never be at peace.
Absolutely.
That's the way I see it. So we can lure them with the lifting of sanctions, but it's not going to work.
Well, I think it's a little bit too late for the lifting of sanctions.
Exactly.
I mean, right. the appropriate relationships have already been established. So, I mean, my concern here overall is I absolutely do not want war, especially, I mean, in the Middle East. Absolutely not. To me, there is really few to no reasons for war in general. And so I'm always erring on the side of, looking at the narrative, because does this narrative continue the conflict?
Yeah.
Right? Does the report that came out of this intelligence agency, does it prolong the conflict? Does it give a reason to prolong the conflict? Now, it might be true.
Yeah.
Looking at some of the other analysis and assessments of the site itself, a lot of people are basically saying that it's true that, this really didn't do a whole lot.
Yeah.
However, I am in support of ending this conflict and allowing cooler heads to really come forward, and diplomacy to really come forward.
Yeah.
So if this is going to aggravate the situation and turn the spout of violence back on, I am curious as to what the motivations were for this leaked document.
Well, because they wanted to maintain the war machine, like always. Remember the Afghan conflict. How long did it take? The Iraq conflict. How long did it take?
Yeah.
That's why they don't want it. They don't want it to end soon. Where the difference is with Iran vis-a-vis Libya, Iraq, or Afghanistan, or Somalia for that matter, Iran still has options, and one of them will be. And by the way, I'm going to be talking about this soon, guys. So I'm going to put the link for you in the chat box. And one of the options is the option of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz still on the table? And my answer
That's a great
is yes.
question. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's because Iran has other avenues. It has other cards to play. They're just not going to show everything. So what the U.S. is trying to do, in coordination with Israel, by the way, this is not just the U.S. There is a coordination going on with Israel, is that they wanted to minimize the offensive of the Iranian missiles. It's because what Iran did inside Israel was not expected. I saw some footage last night of some massive destructions inside Israel. So the fact that Iran's missiles are launching, and I'm not surprised. Back then when I wrote the Iran book, and I mentioned, should Iran ever be attacked, mark my word, they're going to shower Tel Aviv with missiles. And of course, I had somebody in the government said, "Whoa, you don't want to say this." I was like, "Hold on a second. It's not classified. It's a public information if you know where to look for and how to read the assessments. Simple as that." Then they allow me to disclose that in an article that I wrote back in 2017. So, and that's my point. So when we hear this cooked up intelligence coming up, don't trust that, guys. Don't buy it, especially for our American viewers. You know how corrupted our government is. When I say government, I'm referring to Washington, not the people. The Washington. There are some good people out there, like Thomas Massey. You give Guy credit, but they're gonna silence him one way or another.
Yeah, they really tried hard. They really tried hard.
Yeah. I admire the guy for the courage he's taken, but you need more than one individual. So, but also this reflects how failed our system is, because we're reaching the end. That's basically what it amounts to. We are reaching the end. And like we always say, when everything fails, what they do? They take you to war.
Absolutely.
So they want to drag this on longer than
before we get to China, and we'll get to China next, but there was a very interesting thought leader that my husband actually sent me a video of yesterday, and it spoke what I was thinking. And it was basically, he said that the elites built a system that they knew would never last, like they knew wasn't going to be sustainable. Because we talk about, the system doesn't work, that we're in right now. Well, the system works just fine for the people at the top. For the people at the top, it actually works really great. It's for the rest of us that it doesn't work out that great, but that's not who, the rest of us unfortunately are not in charge. I wish we were, but we're not. And so the system the way that he suggested it was the system was never designed to be sustainable. It was never meant to be sustainable. It was meant to put enormous amounts of power and enormous amounts of money in the hands of the people at the very top. And so now that it's collapsing, it's not collapsing for the people at the top. It's collapsing for us, for everybody else.
That's true.
And so it was an interesting way to think about that, because we're not looking at people who accidentally set up the system like this. These people have known that it was on its way down probably from the beginning and set it up this way anyway, because it's working out for them either way.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there, because we're talking about the fall and the collapse like it's an accident. And maybe it is. But it's not so much of an accident that everyone is equally being impacted by it.
Yeah.
It's only a certain portion of the population that's being impacted by it. So, is it on purpose? Is it controlled demolition? Maybe. I'll put that to you guys to make your own decision. China. Let's dive into China and Russia, because they've had some interesting hands in what's gone on.
Yeah. Well, let's start with Russia first. So when we think about Russia, there's a lot of conversation coming up now as to, did Russia just dropped or abandoned Iran? It's not easy to answer that question, because the reason being, you have to consider the strategic interest of each country. And any country, I don't care what country that is, it has to think about its strategic interest, national strategic interest, that is. So the only difference in this case here, which an average person will be asking, is how come Russia abandoned its friend, its allies, in time of need? That is where the key. So of course the US is going to, there are certain media outlets in the US will add more fuel to the fire regarding this issue. Why? It's because they want to create that what's the word I'm looking for? I drew a blank. I couldn't think of the word. Yeah.
That's doubt. Okay. It's been a long couple of weeks, David.
Yeah, doubt. They want to create doubt by the more they talk about how the Russians abandoned their friends in time of need, the more you start to think, well, can we ever trust the Russians and so forth? Well, you need to understand that the relationship between Russia and Iran is strong, except that Russia is not going to send weapons openly. And if they do, they're going to send it through a third party. One of the examples that I can give you, I won't be surprised that if some type of weapons arrive to Iran, but it might come from some third party country like North Korea. Yeah. Well, believe it or not, that weapon might not be from North Korea, but rather from Russia. It just has been diverted that way, which is a normal practice. We do it. We have done it throughout the decades. We never send the weapons directly. We'll go through a third party. I'll give you a quick example. When we were fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, who do you think was providing those weapons to the Mujahideen? And through whom we were providing the weapons? It was through Saudi Arabia. So that's my point.
Weapons and funding. I mean, I want to bring up that also, because both sides.
It was, FYI, it was the Saudis that funded the Mujahideen through the petrodollar. It was a conversation between King Fahd at that time and Reagan, and in a closed door session, that's when the deal was made. And through the Prince of Saudi Arabia at that time, Prince Bandar, who was the Saudi ambassador, the longest serving ambassador in Washington, 20 years in that position.
Wow.
And by the way, that guy used to just walk inside the White House without signing the log. He's just walking, doesn't need an appointment. That just gives you an idea right there. So the same arguments I can make now about the Russians, except that the Russians will have to think in terms of the strategic interest. And we should not rule out one possibility. And that possibility is that Mr. Trump reached out to Putin behind closed doors and asked for Russia not to support Iran in return for some favor. And again, I'm just thinking outside the box.
That's not impossible. Yeah. That's not impossible. And especially because, like, we've sort of heard reports of Trump calling this dignitary and that dignitary. So Trump's calling around. So it's very possible that that was something that he did, was sort of because he has sort of asked people to calm the situation down a little bit. To his credit, I mean, it's not like he does every single thing wrong, but to his credit, and quite frankly, if he bombed empty nuclear facilities, that might have been to his credit too. Like, I know he's getting like shut down for it, but if it's something that de-escalated a situation that might turn into World War III, I mean, this may not be a popular opinion, but de-escalation first and then diplomacy after that to follow it up. So I don't know how well the diplomacy is going to work, but the de-escalation first.
Yeah, but I respectfully disagree with you on that.
Okay.
And the reason being, because you are forcing me through the gun to negotiate. Why will I even sit down and have negotiations with you to begin with? But that means in this case, the US is not coming on an equal footing. And I don't see any logical head of state will even agree to something like this. I see your point in the idea that let's just do this symbolic bombing of an empty space, then we'll move into the negotiations. But it's not going to work given the mindset of the Iranians or the whole region. They don't see it that way. They think differently than we do. So, and that's one point that I have to sort of just think about it. I thought about that one. Maybe they will do this, but Iranians are not going to see it that way. They're already saying now, forget about negotiations with the Americans. And
well,
rightly
for
so,
sure. But you know, there's always the stuff that's happening in the front, and there's always the stuff that's happening in the back.
That is true.
Right. And so the stuff that's happening in the front is the stuff that governments have to do and say to
for domestic consumption.
For domestic consumption. Exactly. For domestic consumption. And then, you know, and it gets people all riled up because there is what are the two things you don't talk about at like a family gathering? It's like religion and politics, right? Because it gets people all riled up and everyone's all riled up and there's tons of emotion about this stuff. And there really is inside populations. There's tons and tons of emotion about it. And rightfully so. I mean, this is scary stuff. And there's a lot of fear about it, but then, so there's the domestic consumption, right? And so every country is telling its own people a different narrative. It's not the same thing. Everyone is telling their people what a great job they did, right? If you look at everybody's media, everyone believes that their country is the one that did the best job. Okay, well, so did all of the countries do the best job? Did all of the countries? So there's two things going on. There's the public war, and then there's the private war dash diplomacy. Diplomacy is like a rough word for that because it doesn't always mean that something good happens, but like the conversation that's happening behind the scenes. And so in this, I mean, this case is no different. If you look at every single country, every leader of every country is like, we're doing the best job. We're doing great. Well, okay, so the truth is somewhere in the middle of that, right? So I'm always very curious. And I think that's why it's very possible that you're right, David, that Trump went to Putin and maybe even Xi and said, hey, let's calm this thing down. Like, this does not have to go this way. Yeah,
well, actually, the US did reach out to China yesterday. Actually, I am aware of this and I have proof for it. So they are asking for China to really talk to Iran because they know the US won't be able to. I think, and again, I am convinced, as I said earlier, this conflict will be the last nail on a coffin for the US and Israel for that matter. In other words, the partnership in the Middle East. Middle East will never be the same, or West Asia will never be the same again. You know, where the key question we ought to ask right now before we leave is this: if Iran decided to move forward in the same path North Korea did or Pakistan, would you see other countries in the region, the likes of Turkey, the likes of Saudi Arabia, and the likes of United Arab Emirates or Qatar, because those they can afford it financially, embark on a nuclear program?
I think that is a fantastic idea, or that's a fantastic question. And it is the question going forward right now. That's true. You know, with this, the way that it happened, what is that part of the world going to look like, and what does it look like for the United States going forward? Was this a really big win, a really big loss? I think your question about is the closing of the Strait of Hormuz still an option is a really big, important question, especially related to China. Do you want to dive into China a little bit?
Well,
we're
how
kind
about
of
if we talk about it tomorrow? How about we leave it for tomorrow?
Sounds good.
We'll do China tomorrow, guys.
Yeah, we'll do
you.
more of China, Russia, and all of this tomorrow because we are running out of time. And David, I want to make sure you take care of yourself.
Let me say thank you, Rafael.
Sure that neither we nor our Israeli partners are going to try and intervene and destroy their countries. And in fact, most observers that know more about the region than I do tell me that the Iranian government is now stronger than it's been in decades. The population has lined up behind it, which shouldn't surprise anybody. I mean, we've been down this road before. This is just the beginning. And I think before it's all through, we're going to see the map in the Middle East change profoundly.
Well, everyone, I'm very honored to welcome back into the studio Colonel Douglas McGregor, one of the great insiders into all things geopolitics. Colonel, how are you this evening?
Great. Good to see you.
Well, Colonel, it's so good to have you back into the show because last time we talked about the escalation between Iran and Israel. Of course, the United States getting dragged into this. I want to know your initial reaction to this ceasefire between Israel and Iran. More importantly, what is the long-term consequences for both countries moving forward?
I think it's important to mention up front, because I get this question all the time. What is Donald Trump's strategy? What is American national strategy? And so forth. And I have to tell them, I don't see much evidence for strategy, because strategy means that you have a clearly defined purpose. You know how you want to achieve that purpose, and you know what you would like things to look like after you accomplish your purpose.
Right.
I don't see any thinking like that. I think everything is impulsive and reactionary or reactive. And that's part of the reason why probably you, I, and so many other people are confused as to what's happening. From day to day, things change dramatically. If you listen to President Trump today and compare it with things that he said less than a year ago, there's no connectivity at all. It's completely changed. He might as well be Joe Biden at this point. And his administration seems to have completely realigned itself to the Biden approach. So it's sort of reminiscent of something that somebody said recently. We keep voting for somebody that we think is new, who's going to do things differently, and we discover that we got John McCain again. And now increasingly people here are calling President Trump an orange McCain. So I suppose that in a nutshell is the problem. So when we ask, can you help us understand X, Y, and Z? That's not easy, because I just can't.
I want to kind of get into this because it's interesting. They're calling it a 12-day war. We've had a ceasefire now. Of course, all sides are claiming victory, right? Israel's claiming victory. Trump is saying it's a great victory. Iran has claimed victory. Did anybody actually accomplish anything during this?
Well, it depends on which side of the fence you sit. I think if you're sitting on the Iranian side, you have demonstrated several important things. First of all, that your arsenal is infinitely more powerful and more capable than perhaps even you thought. This man, his name is, I think it's Ben Gvir, who's one of the inner circle members for Mr. Netanyahu and one of the strongest advocates for mass slaughter in Gaza and the destruction of virtually everybody who's not Jewish in the Middle East. He was heard on speaking publicly, saying, you know, when he was answering, why have you asked the United States to step in this soon? And he said, well, we underestimated the Iranian arsenal and their capability. I think they did. And they forgot the lesson that no matter how good your supposed defenses are, the enemy can always overwhelm your defenses with enough projectiles, with enough missiles. So I think we're learning that again. We should have learned that to some extent from the Russo-Ukrainian war. Right. So the idea that you can build some sort of air and missile defense that's going to keep everything out is absurd. The problem is that for every missile that is shot at you, you fire 2 or 3 back. So if 500 missiles are shot at you or 200 missiles, that means you've shot 400 in response. Inevitably, they're going to get through. We've always learned that. So I think that's the first thing. So from that standpoint, I think Iran has probably made its point. I don't know if I would call it victorious, but it's won its argument. The second thing is we have this problem in the United States where unconditional support for Israel and anything that Israel wants to do is the policy. Doesn't matter which party. It's irrelevant. Now, you can attribute that to many things. You can attribute it to the fact that we all love Israel, and I certainly have nothing against Israel per se, but I don't believe in unconditionally supporting any country in the world. In fact, come to think of it, I don't even unconditionally support my own. You know, the problem is that if you take that position, then you are obliged on most occasions to do whatever the Israelis want you to do, give them whatever money they need, share whatever technology with them they demand. So I think that's been a problem. And it has brought us to this point in time. Remember, we never mentioned Gaza. Gaza is irrelevant, doesn't come up for discussion, but people die every day, every night in Gaza and continue to do so. Population there has dropped by supposedly as many as 400,000+. How many have died from various diseases? How many have been killed outright? Who knows? How many have left? I have no idea. But the Arabs have generally taken a position that they would rather die than leave their land. So I suspect that most of that is death in Gaza. That goes on, and that is a permanent catalyst for conflict between Israel and its neighbors. And the notion that you're going to come to some sort of solution with Iran, which I doubt that everyone's going to be satisfied with, and that's going to solve the problem is wrong. So that's a permanent problem. The unwillingness to step up and solve that, Donald Trump's unwillingness to face it, mention it, and do anything about it speaks volumes. The Israelis have decided to join the celebration that Iran's nuclear development capacity is dead. I don't see any evidence for that at all. And my sources in the intelligence community here and abroad tell me that those targets were largely empty, that there was nothing there. So we destroyed nothing. However, it was great from an optical standpoint. We blew all these things up. Nobody stopped us. There were no air defense missiles shot at us. No jamming, no counter strikes of any kind against our incoming aircraft and missiles. And then subsequently the next day, the Iranians obliged us by telling us that they were going to attack a target, told us in advance, told us where it was. And they obviously knew that we'd already evacuated Bahrain, the facilities there. So they blew up the airbase and sort of called it a day. It strikes me, and this I believe is true for President Trump, because if there's one thing I can say about him, I know he doesn't want war. Probably he doesn't know how to prevent it and how to stop it, or if he does, he can't do it. He did not want a war with Iran, and Iran does not want a war with us. I mean, that's clear. So here we're back again to the Israel question. Is there some sort of long-term goal here that will take us away from future conflict and hostilities? I don't see any. So how long will it last? 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, longer? Who knows? I think it'll eventually break down. Now, here's the last point, the most important one on my judgment, really. The Israelis are running out of cash and missiles. Smotrich, the finance minister, had spoken just a couple of days ago and said, we've got another week, maybe 2 weeks before the economy implodes. So there it is from the horse's mouth. We have no cash and we have no missiles. You know, that's the other thing. They've shot most everything. Our own vessels at sea have shot off most of theirs. So you got to go back to port to reload. We aren't building missiles fast enough to keep up with the pace. And the question is, where does it all lead? My concern now is after this experience, virtually everybody who can get a nuclear weapon is going to go out and get one, because that's the only way to be sure that neither we nor our Israeli partners are going to try and intervene and destroy their countries. Remember that Mr. Netanyahu's goal, unlike Trump, he has a very clear, unambiguous picture in mind. It's called Libya. That's what he wants. And then remember the financial interests in London and in New York City that were strongly in favor of war with Russia, using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia to remove Putin from power and ultimately to strip Russia of its resources by breaking it up and fragmenting it and so forth. That has failed. So now they've turned that strategy on Iran and on the region. They want the oil and gas fields. There's no question about it. And this goes back to another strategy that you've got to go back into the 90s when the neocons, people like Richard Pearl and Wolfowitz and others, postulated that if we can get control of all these oil and gas resources, then we have China by the throat. This is back in the 90s before China became, in everybody's mind, the boogeyman. So you have all of this sort of business floating around. It's all involved. And I don't think this war in the Middle East is by any stretch of the imagination over. I think it's ongoing. This is a pause. We'll see how long it lasts and where we go from here. But I think in the short run, again, the president of Iran has said, we don't want a nuclear weapon. We are going to stay in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We support a nuclear-free zone.
Right.
Well, that would mean Israel would have to give up its weapons. If Israel gives up its weapons, it's not in a position to intimidate or bully its neighbors and to dominate the region, which is what they want to do. There is no greater Israel project without nuclear preeminence and the threat of nuclear domination. So where do we go? I don't know.
I mean, and just for our viewers out there, I believe Israel is the only country in the region that does have nuclear weapons, around 90 nuclear warheads. So they're interesting enough, the only one that does have them, hence why they can project that power and certainly aggression where they need, like you had said, this greater Israel vision. Let's talk about regime change. That's something that we heard Donald Trump say earlier. He hinted at regime change. It's obviously has been the goal of Netanyahu with many countries in the Middle East to get that regime change, almost going on this philosophy as if you do not support Israel and get behind us and our stance of not supporting the Palestinians, you need to have a regime change. And of course, the U.S. has launched many, many wars in the Middle East, to adhere to that policy. Do you think that this will continue to be Israel's goal? I mean, will they continue to pursue this regime change? Do you think this will even come from the United States in the future?
Yes, as long as Israel has the unconditional support of the United States for whatever it wants to do, which I think it still has, then it makes sense that they would want regime change. They advertised this former, or I shouldn't say former, but the uncrowned crown prince of Persia or Iran, the son of the Shah, as their candidate for puppet rule in Tehran. So I think that lingers, that persists. They would like to break up Iran. Iran is a multi-ethnic, I guess you could say multi-confessional as well, state. But I think they've discovered that certainly culturally, there's more homogeneity there than people anticipated, and the population did not turn on the government. And in fact, most observers that know more about the region than I do tell me that the Iranian government is now stronger than it's been in decades. The population has lined up behind it, which shouldn't surprise anybody. I mean, we've been down this road before. And so Iran, this is a civilizational state, if you will, that rests on the foundations of Persian culture and history and language. And I think as a result, it's more resolute and more capable of withstanding external attack than I think anybody believed. Everybody was thinking in terms, I suspect, of Iraq. But Iraq, like Jordan and the Emirates, these are things that were created in the Versailles Peace Conference, literally by the British Empire. They're not rooted in very much. Now, you could certainly say, well, the people in the Emirates, they had places on oases where they had, capitals, and there was a sort of a nation state of some kind there. Okay, that's fine. But fundamentally speaking, these are not in the same category as Iran by any means. And the same thing is true for Iraq. One of two things is going to happen. Peace is going to break out, and we're going to join hands and sing Kumbaya, and it's all over. Or this is just the beginning. And I think before it's all through, we're going to see the map in the Middle East change profoundly. Because from between Iran and Egypt, all of those places could change. Everything could change. the Iraqis, for instance, still, or the people sitting in Baghdad at any rate that are Shia, view Kuwait as part of their country. I don't know that they'll act on that immediately, but we ought to keep that in mind. I think we're going to see more problems in Syria. We went along with the Mossad, CIA, MI6 plan to finally destabilize and destroy Syria, but the price for that was cooperation with Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. Now, Mr. Erdogan wants to control Syria from Damascus north. Damascus is a great city of the Islamic world. One of the most famous and original Turkish sultans is interred there in the great mosque in Damascus. So I think there's a lot more going on there. And this sort of arrangement between the Turks and the Israelis, that they're going to sort of cooperate in order to exert some degree of hegemony over the region, I don't think it's going to last. The Turks are biding their time. They too have always known that if they needed a nuclear weapon, they could get it from Pakistan.
Right.
And I think that's true. So I think we're in for more. And then, by the way, then the only other sort of civilizational state that you've got that's rooted historically and has a strong foundation is Egypt. So it's, Israel, and greater Israel is wedged in between Egypt on the one side, Iran and Turkey on the other, with these sort of oil emirates in between, and the Saudis. I think it's all up for grabs in the future.
Do you think that Israel is going to be the one that's going to potentially break this ceasefire? I mean, do you think we've got peace for right now, but, they're going to be looking for another opportunity as soon as, for example, we know for a fact that Iran's uranium has certainly not been damaged with these strikes. They already had said that they had moved the uranium to another place. Again, they're not looking to develop a nuclear bomb per se, but they certainly want to have it for civilian use. Do you foresee that Israel is going to go down that road and potentially the ceasefire would break with some Israeli aggression?
Well, from the Israeli standpoint, what has changed in the region? Nothing. In fact, this open-ended war that Netanyahu launched after the 7th of October, and by the way, I'm still convinced that 7th October was not an accident. I think that was allowed to happen. There were too many people on the inside in the Israeli Defense Force and the intelligence committee that warned about this, even to the point where the Egyptians, who have always dreaded Hamas, never liked Hamas, and they don't like Islamist terrorism. I mean, who would? It's got a brain. And they alerted the Israelis 24 hours beforehand. We think this is imminent. We know that. What happened? Nothing. And I've been there, and I've seen the Israeli position outside of Gaza, and it's very good. I mean, they had this thing wired tightly, and brilliant operation, in my judgment. So this was not an accident. This then conveniently became the foundation for this broader regional war that Netanyahu and his supporters wanted to launch. Now, keep in mind, that made a lot of sense strategically for Netanyahu because he's got control of us.
Right.
He has far more influence, power, and control in the Senate and the House than President Trump does.
Right.
So why would you give that up and walk away? Right now, nothing has changed profoundly here in the United States. We haven't really been hurt by anything. I think President Trump was worried about the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. He was sensitive to that. And again, I know him. He's not somebody who wants a war. The problem is, what difference does that make if you can't take decisive steps to stop it from breaking out? I mean, the man who was probably more opposed to war in 1914 than anybody else in Europe was the German Kaiser. And even the British and French ambassadors, on the day that war was declared, Germany finally entered the war, they both said that this is a very sad day for the emperor because he doesn't want this. What difference did it make? I mean, he could have taken steps to stop it. He didn't. So my concern is that nothing has really fundamentally changed at this stage, and we should expect more trouble down the line. And if who's going to start it? Well, if you take Netanyahu away, what changes? You don't like Netanyahu? Okay, Netanyahu goes away. They try him for God knows what else. He ends up sitting in jail for a while. Then he's pardoned and he's out. Retires to Miami or New York City or something. I don't know. So you've got what have you got then to replace him? Somebody else steps in. He's faced with the same dilemma. The same strategic conundrum is there, regardless of who takes over in Israel. So I don't see how you avoid another round, if you will. And I suspect each round could become far worse and more destructive. My concern from the beginning, and many Israelis were very angry with me, you got to support us. And I said, I don't see anything good coming out of this. I have a bad feeling that this is a suicidal path for Israel. Right. Well, they say, we hate you. You're wrong. You're not the man we thought you were. Okay, fine. But I still believe that. And I think the last few months have proven it.
Yeah. Colonel, I want to know what you think about how is this situation being interpreted in Moscow and Beijing? What are the Russians? What are the Chinese? How are they interpreting this war and what this means for the future?
The Chinese and the Russians are interested in this One Belt, One Road project that is designed to essentially link, even integrate to some extent, economic interests across Central Asia, Eurasia, into Africa. In other words, the world island that we talked about for years. The idea is that you integrate this through rail, various forms of transportation. The railroad has just been completed from China to Iran, and they've had the first freight trains arrive and so forth.
Correct.
China knows that it's at risk because of the United States Navy. Chinese history teaches that their great vulnerability is this long coastline, and they're dependent on commerce over the seas. The Royal Navy came in there and made it very clear that China was at the mercy of the Royal Navy. Here's this little country called Great Britain, halfway around the world, and yet it can demand and impose on China. That is then followed by the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. And the Imperial Japanese Navy repeats the process that the Royal Navy repeated, takes over the South China Sea and establishes itself on Taiwan. All the major invasions and attacks on China, with very few exceptions, were organized, assembled, and launched from Taiwan. So the Chinese they view Taiwan the same way we would view Cuba. It's a platform. And the Chinese don't want that. They don't want war, and they don't want to have to tangle with us because, frankly, in this world today, 5 or 6 nuclear attack submarines could shut down China from the sea in a matter of a few days. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out. Right. So you build the One Belt, One Road, and it goes everywhere. And the Russians certainly see great benefit in this to themselves. And the Chinese need the Russians because without the Russians, there is no peace in Central Asia. That's what people don't understand. Right. Russia is key to peace and stability in Central Asia. The various leaders of the Central Asian states, we call them the stands, they all trust Putin and rely on him. They don't particularly care for the Chinese. That goes back to the Turkic Mongolian heritage and history. And the Chinese are very afraid of Central Asia. And one thing that both the Russians and the Chinese can agree on is they don't want another Genghis Khan. So there's a condominium of interest there. And the Russians, of course, want to do business with Europe. They need it. They've always needed good relations with Germany. They've needed German technology and engineering and know-how. They want that restored. They want a good relationship. Remember the Baghdad to Berlin Railroad that the Kaiser was trying to build back before 1914, because they were trying to build relationships. That was seen as threatening to Great Britain. So Britain then said, Germany's the enemy because this will do what? This will circumvent the sea. Right now, you've got a similar problem with the Suez Canal. If you can build through these railroads and pipelines across Eurasia, then you don't need to ship everything through the Suez Canal. In other words, there are a lot of game-changing strategic developments associated with Russia and China that we have decided, along with our British allies, to stop if we can do it. I think it's a waste of time, and I think we should try to capitalize on it, view this as something that could be positive for us. Nobody wants to say that in Washington. So a lot of that is behind all the machinations. And Israel, of course, is a creature of the British Empire. And Israel is very much in the vanguard of grabbing and gaining control of those oil and gas fields. That's greater Israel. It's all bound up together. So who thinks this is going to stop? Who thinks that President Trump can stand up and say, I've changed my mind, it's over, it's not going to happen? These are big strategic dynamics that are in motion now. Hard to stop.
Yeah. Colonel, I've got one final question. I want to relate this now to Ukraine, because we've seen a little bit of a shift from Trump as well, where, he's already hinted that he potentially could start sending some more weapons to Ukraine. Of course, actually during this war, we did see the United States start shifting a lot of weapons over to Israel. Obviously, they are going to support Israel much more than Ukraine. So initially, this was a big loss for Zelensky. And I think now, though, has the focus now shifted back to Ukraine? Is this actually a positive thing for Ukraine? And what are your thoughts on this conflict? Is this the next chess piece that Trump needs to solve in his geopolitical game?
Well, Zelensky and Netanyahu, in their own ways, are very similar and in similar strategic positions. Although I would argue Zelensky is probably even worse off than Netanyahu. Netanyahu is now in a cauldron of hate. The people in the region have collectively decided that they cannot coexist with Israel. It's a simple truth. And that's everyone from Morocco to the border with India and well up into Central Asia. Sorry, you can't do it. You can't call everyone Amalek, subhuman species that deserves to be exterminated, and then win friends and influence people. Right. So that's a bad position for Netanyahu, and I don't see that changing. Move to Zelensky. Zelensky has lost at least 1.5 million dead in this war, Ukrainian soldiers. He continues to lose every day. And the Russians are now doing something that they have been practicing, but they've gotten very good at it. And that is, you systematically move forward across eastern Ukraine, eradicating all of the Ukrainian resistance that you find anywhere. So Luhansk, for instance, is now Ukrainian free in terms of resistance. And I think they're moving forward to the Dnieper River. I think they will cross it and they will go into Kiev and they will crush whatever is there, and they will move south to take Odessa. Then Ukraine ends up as this rump state that has no outlet to the sea. That is, as it historically was for hundreds of years, entirely dependent upon the lines of communication that run back through Poland and Lithuania. Because for most of its history, Poland and Lithuania is what controlled it. And then it was carved up into pieces, and for a short time, not quite 200 years, it was partially Austrian in Western Ukraine, which accounts for differences in the people and language and so forth that you see there. And what President Putin has always understood is that the people that live in Western Ukraine are really Ukrainians. There's no halfway house. It's not partial. And they're different. They speak a different language. They're a different ethnic mix. He doesn't want to rule them under any circumstances. So he just doesn't want to go there. That's more trouble than it's worth. And that's why the joke in Moscow is, well, perhaps the Poles will go back in there. And they all laugh because the Poles and the Ukrainians, of course, spent a lot of time trying to butcher each other and murder each other. So, but that's better from the Russian standpoint than going in there and stupidly trying to occupy the place. So I think Zelensky's days are numbered, and the Russians are coming, really, seriously, literally. And I don't think it makes any difference what we send to them. All we're doing is prolonging the death. I mean, Ukraine is a terminally ill patient on life support. The humane thing to do is pull it, and it should have been pulled a long time ago. Because once people know what that place is like and what the people are going through, they'll be horrified. This is not a nice place. And they'll look into the numbers of children that have been spirited away, and women, and God knows what else in that country. Ukraine is a tragic place. So it's on life support. The life support will eventually be pulled sooner rather than later. It'll be over. And I think President Trump is very frustrated because he made this statement, I could end that war in 24 hours. Well, it's absurd. It's far too complex for that. And a failure, he has found it impossible to do something that I thought he would do, which is recognize legitimate security interests of Russia. But you see, in Washington, D.C., Russia is a place to be hated. Russians have to be hated. Everything that comes out of Russia is bad. And given the nature of this current administration, I don't think they can change that.
Yeah.
So Russia will win. Russia's already won the battle militarily. It's just now consolidating it. They will cross. They'll do the things I said. This thing will sort of sputter out. And the Europeans, they're looking at sweeping change. All of the so-called evil right-wing nationalist parties are poised to roar forward and take over. And that's, I think, something that the Russians are watching. And I think they will welcome that because those parties are absolutely opposed to war with Russia, as they should be. It's insane. And then we can stop deindustrializing Europe and reducing everybody in Europe to poverty and, abject failure. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
We increasingly are going to retreat back to the United States because our problems here are legion, and we're not addressing them at all. We're pretending to address them. So I think if you look at that picture, that's where we're headed. The only question is, how rapidly do we get there? Is it going to be slow? Is it going to be? I think it's going to be. What's the right word? In stages. With some things will go quicker than others in different places, but that's where we're headed.
Yeah. Well, Colonel, I want to thank you so much for your time today. It's always
Right. So when your last war ends with $20 billion in damages, your surgical strikes hit everything but their targets, your military pride gets pounded into rubble by a barrage of enemy missiles, you'd think the smart move would be to step back, regroup, and maybe, just maybe, reconsider your approach. But the problem isn't necessarily them, but it's you. But for Israel's leadership, failure, rather than being a lesson to learn from, being a deterrent to repeating the same mistakes, efforts must simply be redoubled instead. Still, mere days after being handed their backsides on a plate by Iran's Operation True Promise 3, Israel's leaders aren't reflecting. They're plotting, and not subtly either. According to reports, they've just been caught red-handed scheming to stage a false flag attack on US territory and pin the blame on Iran, all in a desperate bid to drag Washington back into war against Iran on their behalf. Warnings of Israel doing such a thing already having come out some time ago, desperate as Netanyahu is. The plan was foiled, thankfully, thanks to a timely warning from an unnamed third country. The very fact that such a dangerous deception was allegedly in motion reveals a disturbing truth: that Israel's appetite for war is matched only by its contempt for international norms and its faith that the United States will cover the tab, clean up the mess, and keep believing the lies. With Trump back on the scene barking threats, depleted uranium being thrown at Iran much as they did to Lebanon last year, and Netanyahu's government pretending the last disaster was just a dress rehearsal and they'll be ready for the real thing next time, one thing does seem very clear. The sequel to Israel's failed war with Iran may already be in production, and this time the stakes are even higher, and Israel have even fewer scruples. Right, so the 12-day war between Israel and Iran left a scar across the Middle East. It should have prompted some sober reflection, some diplomacy and some de-escalation, especially on Israel's part. Instead, Israel appears determined to reignite those hostilities, emboldened not by success, they didn't have any. They failed on every single one of their stated goals of ending Iran's nuclear program and initiating regime change, but by desperation instead. Despite sustaining enormous losses, military, economic, and reputational, Tel Aviv is once again potentially laying the groundwork for renewed confrontation with Tehran. And this has been ramped up all the more by recent reports suggesting this effort has included a foiled false flag operation meant to strike US territory and blame it on Iran. a ploy that, had it succeeded, could have triggered catastrophic conflict and the US becoming far more vociferous in their involvement. This news has come out courtesy of Squawk Box and Tehran Times. Fair play, Iranian source, and revealed that Israeli operatives had planned a false flag attack on the US with the intent of blaming Iran. The operation, reportedly thwarted by an unnamed third country that shared intelligence with the United States and Iran, was a calculated attempt to provoke American military intervention against Iran during a fragile ceasefire. According to the report, the scheme bore all the hallmarks of Israeli clandestine operations: precision, deniability, and manipulation of foreign policy through deceit. But without any actual details as to what the operation was, nor who issued the warning, there is caveats to be had with this. This is not without precedent, it has to be said. Historical instances such as the 1954 Lavon affair, in which Israeli agents attempted to bomb British and American civilian targets in Egypt in order to sour relations between Cairo and the West. There have also been persisting allegations that the shooting of the 2 Israeli embassy staff in Washington just last month was also a false flag. Again, still to be proven in that case. These illustrate a disturbing pattern in Israeli history: Israel's willingness to engineer pretexts for war for their own ends that actually undermines all of its claims of self-defense and reveals a deeper, much more cynical agenda, that the perpetuation of their regional dominance through manufactured conflict is more important to them than peace. Especially right now when Netanyahu has failed to push back his corruption trial again. The timing of this, let's bear that in mind. So he needs another war. It's kept working for him up until now, hasn't it? But the US government is now fully aware of his latest deception should, in theory, constrain its future actions. Any American political figure, particularly Donald Trump, who echoes anti-Iran rhetoric now, when he absolutely is, of course, does so in full knowledge that a key ally has attempted to manipulate them into war. Of course, with so many other news outlets seemingly ignoring this story completely, though, no investigation happening by so-called journalists may mean there isn't much in it on one hand, but a cynic might figure it's being played down heavily due to the further damage such revelations might do to public perception of Israel, already decimated as that has been. The backdrop to this false flag plot, allegation, of course, has been the dramatic exchange of hostilities between Israel and Iran. Israel's preemptive strike, Operation Rising Lion, was framed as a decisive blow against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. In reality, it proved ineffectual and precipitated a far more devastating response. Iran's Operation True Promise 3 targeted over 30 Israeli military and industrial sites, including drone manufacturing facilities, intelligence outposts, and even a pilot's training center. The scale of damage inflicted by Iran was unprecedented. Initial Israeli estimates put the economic cost of the war, just those 12 days of it, at approximately $20 billion, a figure that includes both physical infrastructure damage and the vast expenditure on defensive measures such as missile interceptors. The Israeli government was subsequently forced to request additional US financial assistance, a humiliating admission of how ill-prepared it was for the scale of the Iranian retaliation, drastically underestimated as they had. Iran's strategic use of hypersonic and low-altitude missiles, including the Fatah-1, came as a massive shock to Israel and the US, especially in how it overwhelmed Israeli and US air defense systems. Notably, the US expended over $800 million, nearly $1 billion worth of THAAD interceptor missiles, roughly 20% of the global stockpile of those munitions as that was, just to defend Israel over the 12 days of that conflict. Yet despite this investment, Iran's projectiles struck their targets repeatedly, demonstrating that advanced Western missile defenses were no match for Iran's evolving military technology. Rather than acknowledge its strategic missteps, though, the Israeli government has adopted a posture of renewed aggression. The increasingly insane Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has publicly threatened to resume attacks on Iranian missile sites and nuclear facilities, claiming that Operation Rising Lion was merely a preview. Such rhetoric is not only irresponsible, especially given the scale of damage we have now seen confirmed done to Israel, but disingenuous and hypocritical with it. If, as Katz claims, as Trump has also claimed, that Iran's nuclear program was destroyed, why the need for renewed strikes on these sites? You've destroyed all of their nuclear facilities and their program and their enriched uranium, according to you. You've obliterated it all. So why the need, unless you're lying? European intelligence reports seem to bear that out too, contradicting those Israeli and American claims of success. According to the Cradle, Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles survived the attacks and remain intact. Furthermore, in response to the violations of its sovereignty, Iran passed legislation ending cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, effectively severing one of the few remaining links to nuclear diplomacy, blaming IAEA chief Rafael Grossi, as Iran does, of destroying any trust or good faith they have in the agency, following those allegations of leaks made by the IAEA to Israel concerning Iran's nuclear program. But the hypocrisy here ought to be glaring by now when it comes to Israeli and Iranian nuclear assets. Israel is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and it maintains a clandestine nuclear arsenal that they deny, but is one of the worst-kept global secrets going. Yet it demands transparency and compliance from Iran, who still are a signatory state operating within the framework of the NPT. So the double standard is both legally and morally indefensible, and yet still world leaders do it, and increasingly by the boos and jeers of people worldwide refusing to accept such drivel any longer. Iranian officials have also, quite rightly, framed Israel's actions as violations of international law. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian described the 12-day conflict as a clear act of aggression under Article 39 of the United Nations Charter and a blatant breach of Article 2.4, which prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity of another state. He further warned that had Iran not responded proportionally, the conflict could have escalated into a widespread and uncontrollable war. Certainly they had a right to defend themselves, so there were fears with the conflict ongoing that it would still spread that way too. Ultimately, until Israel is reined in, that fear hasn't actually gone away still, I would argue. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi also criticized the ongoing ceasefire, stating that Iran would not accept any halt to operations, that, as is the case with Lebanon, implied an uneven agreement. And certainly with Lebanon abiding by a ceasefire that Israel have abused hundreds of times over now for months on end, his comments have been interpreted as something of a rebuke to Lebanese President Joseph Aoun for letting that situation in his country persist, worsening as it is in the last few days. Meanwhile, Iran has intensified its internal counterintelligence operations, targeting Israeli espionage networks, and an interesting bit of info has come out bearing out their justification for doing so too. An audio recording has come to light that has been authenticated by the Washington Post that captured Mossad operatives threatening Iranian officials and their families with death unless they complied with demands to sabotage Iranian institutions. Western media has again largely downplayed this incident too, though, instead framing Iran's arrests and crackdowns of suspected Mossad spy rings in their territory as authoritarian repression, which is just surreal, but again all serves a narrative that shields Israeli misconduct from scrutiny. Further complicating the humanitarian landscape are reports, much more widely reported this time, it has to be said, that Israel has used depleted uranium munitions during its strikes on Iran. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of the nuclear enrichment process, so there's a bitter irony with Israel deciding to use this. I wonder where they got depleted uranium from themselves. They can't possibly be enriching it themselves for their own nuclear weapons, can they? No, I'm sure that can't possibly be the case. But it's known for its armor-piercing capabilities, this stuff, and it's been used in such applications. However, it is also known for its long-term health risks. International health organizations have linked the use of depleted uranium and the exposure to it to increased rates of leukemia, kidney failure, and congenital abnormalities, particularly amongst children. This is also not the first time Israel has used depleted uranium. Similar weapons were deployed in Lebanon in October of last year. The United States has also been widely criticized for its use of depleted uranium during the 1991 and 2003 invasions of Iraq, which has led to cancer epidemics in several Iraqi cities. Amid all of these developments, the tangerine tyrant that is Donald Trump has re-entered the debate with his characteristic belligerence combined with his unerring stupidity. Following Ayatollah Khomeini's declaration that Iran had won the conflict with Israel, Trump publicly mocked the Iranian leader and threatened renewed strikes just for that basis. His country was decimated, Trump claimed, adding that he had deliberately spared Khomeini's life despite knowing exactly where he was sheltered, he says, saying that the Ayatollah should actually thank him for this too. Trump has also halted what remained of sanctions relief for Iran and implied that any resumption of enrichment activities, still Iran's legal right under the NPT, we have to acknowledge, would trigger another US military response. So who needs Israel to plant a false flag if that's his attitude? Such threats not only undermine diplomatic efforts, but further validate Iran's decision to suspend cooperation with the IAEA, who would report it, even if trust between them and Iran hadn't been so badly damaged as it has. Israel's efforts to restart war with Iran through false flag operations or alleged operations, the foul use of depleted uranium, and ongoing military threats represents a profound danger not only to the Middle East, but to international law and global stability as well. That the United States is aware of Israel's deception and continues to support Tel Aviv regardless is a damning indictment of its foreign policy priorities and Donald Trump's rhetoric. Meanwhile, he's just adding more fuel to a fire that has already burned too many, threatening war again himself. Iran's response, which has been militarily effective, diplomatically assertive, and legally grounded, has so far averted a wider catastrophe. But for how much longer, given Netanyahu needs another distraction fast now, and Trump appears to be sending out the same messaging? The alleged foiled false flag plot needs to still serve as a warning at the very least, though. But should the world continue to ignore Israel's provocations, the next war they instigate could be far worse and on far weaker pretexts. Further warfare might be being mooted again between Israel and Iran, but Israel have already struck again in another way, just not quite in the way you might have expected. They've launched another attack on Iran, but this time there's been a little bit of a twist to it. So check out this video recommendation here to find out more.
Hello again. I'm Larry Johnson. Welcome to Countercurrents. Today I'll be chatting with my friend, colleague, Pepe Escobar. Pepe is, in my view, the preeminent journalist in the world. He gets around. If you're a fan of frequent flyer miles, you'd want to have Pepe's frequent flyer miles. He's truly a world traveler. Hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, my jet lagged friend, you're back. God, tell you what, that Italian restaurant we ate at in Moscow, spectacular.
Bottega Siciliana is one of the top 3 Italians in town. It's really, really good. Yeah. I was there last Sunday.
Oh man. Okay. Well, we'll go from talking something positive. So now let's get on to the heart of the matter.
Yes.
I've titled this sort of the U.S. war on BRICS, and I maintain that what's been going on with Iran is an extension of that war on BRICS. That the terrorist attack in Kashmir was part of that. I think the United States has launched a broad campaign to try to destroy BRICS. What's your take?
Definitely. It's been my main theme, Larry, for months now. Practically every major call in the past few months, this is the main theme. And I put it on the headline already. Well, I'm going to BRICS in Rio. I'm leaving on Monday. I expect to have some serious conversations over there, especially with Brazilian critics of the Brazilian presidency of BRICS, which for the moment is meek, to say it diplomatically.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll try to get to the bottom of it. And obviously, if people from the Ministry of Foreign Relations decide to talk to me, because they prefer not to, because they know what they're going to hear. And of course, with the delegates from other BRICS nations that will be coming to Rio later next week. BRICS starts on Sunday next week, in fact. Well, what we heard in the St. Petersburg Forum was not very, very good. There was an excellent panel on perspectives for reforming the international financial system. And obviously, there were talks about BRICS. There were some pretty good, I would say solid panelists, like one of the directors of VTB, which is the second largest Russian bank. There was my friend Shusentsov from McGill. Shusentsov, he supervises the international relations courses at McGill. He's a very, very good analyst. Unfortunately, they cut him off after 10 minutes. And from Brazil online, my dear friend Paulo Nogueira Batista, who is one of the co-founders of the BRICS Bank, of the NDB. We'll be meeting next week in Rio. And Paulo, in 10 minutes, he destroyed the whole thing. He said, look, let's stop with this hyper-polite talk shop and go for the kill. Because the war is against all of us. Mm-hmm. And, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and the panel, they were doing, no, we have to go slow, one step at a time. And Paulo went straight to the point. And Paulo knows how the BRICS Bank works, and he knows how the BRICS organization works from the inside. He's one of the very few. And one of the very few, because he's out of government, he can speak his mind, But there's going to be serious problems this year. I wonder if the Brazilian presidency will understand, first of all, that the war was hybrid against BRICS, and now it's even hot, considering what happened in Iran. And this is just the beginning of a very long war against all of them, especially the top BRICS, which are under sanctions, Russia, China, and Iran. And, I foresee, sparks will fly, definitely. But it does not look good in terms of, for the rest of this year. First of all, because the Brazilians set up a BRICS summit in the middle of the year, which in itself is totally absurd. So what are they going to do the rest of the year? They would need at least some extra very important meetings. And then this is something that Paulo suggested last year already when he was in Moscow for a few days. The G20 is going to be in South Africa. Why not profit from the fact that most of the BRICS heads of state will be there as well? And then you do a post-summit meeting, a wrap up of the BRICS year, right? I wonder if they're going to accept it. I think many of us will put pressure over there in Rio for something like this to happen. And other Brazilian economists, they completely agree with this position. So we have a conceptual problem this year. And everybody's waiting what BRICS are going to do next year. Meanwhile, Larry, the good part is what we call the BRICS test lab keeps advancing. So they're testing different models. They have conversations about different forms of de-dollarization, trade in bilateral currencies and multilateral currencies expanding all over the spectrum. So these are the positives, right? But I think it's really time for BRICS to step up and be much more incisive, which is what the Russians were preparing last year. The summit last year in Kazan was amazing because the Russians worked for 10 months non-stop to make it a success. And it was a success with the new members, the new partners, etc. And this year, Larry, practically nothing happened.
Yeah.
Since January, practically nothing. It's very distressing. Go ahead, please.
No, let me ask about CIPS, cross-border interbank payment system.
The Chinese system, yes.
CIPS.
CIPS.
Did that come up at St. Petersburg and being integrated into BRICS?
What we learned, Larry, is that the Chinese are going all the way to, let's say, seduce partners to start using CIPS, bypassing SWIFT. So this, this vector of the Chinese being on the forefront of bypassing SWIFT using CIPS, wow. Now it's, to remember, Deep Purple is highway star velocity,
Well, I mean, what's my understanding is that May marked the first time that transactions in CIPS exceeded anything taking place in SWIFT.
Yes, it's true. I read that, yesterday. You're right. Yes.
And it's digital. It uses blockchain technology.
Automatic, immediate.
Yeah. And so
because SWIFT is very slow, as you know.
SWIFT is it's a buggy whip.
Exactly. And sometimes it takes days to have a transaction. It's completely absurd.
So so I wonder if a system like that is actually going to help break through or undermine the U.S. system and bring BRICS more to the forefront.
Well, in terms of Southeast Asia, Central Asia, where China does business with all the major 5 Central Asian countries and increasing business, and even with their partners in West Asia, like Emirates or Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, etc., CIPS is the way to go. Considering that the UAE is at BRICS, at the table as one of the members, full members, and Saudi Arabia is over the wall, but they're still hedging their bets.
Yeah.
But they love the idea because they do a lot of trade with China. And China obviously is saying to the Saudis, look, let's bypass SWIFT in our transactions. And the Saudis won't say no. There's no question about that. So this is one of the ways to go. Absolutely. Yeah. So when we talk about BRICS Lab, something like that, it's part of the test lab, And then when we have the integration with the Russian system, and then with the Iranian system as well, which will happen sooner or later, of course, because of the economic power, financial power of China, CIPS is much more important than the other ones. But the other ones are substantial, especially the Russian system.
Yeah.
Then we could have, for instance, direct transactions among major BRICS, totally bypassing SWIFT, which is something that could happen from this year to the next.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's turn to the recent, I call it the temporary halt in the war against Iran.
You're absolutely correct. Yeah.
This is. Do you think that? Let me step back.
Yes.
I'm surprised that Iran stopped, because they literally had their foot on the throat of Israel.
Absolutely correct.
I mean, they had shut down the only 2 container ports. Mm-hmm. So no more imports that are coming in and out of Israel. They'd shut down the only international airport.
Mm-hmm.
They'd shut down the 2 oil refineries.
Yes.
Not to mention, even though when you look at the map of the different military and intelligence sites hit, that I don't think Israel could have sustained. They would have lost within another 2 to 3 weeks.
That's what all of us. 2 weeks, roughly. Yes.
Why the hell did Iran take its foot off the throttle?
Well, okay, I'll try to give you and our audience, Larry, what really happened in Moscow on Monday. The famous Putin-Lavrov-Arakshi meeting. Can you imagine? A foreign minister comes, instead of meeting only with his counterpart, he has a direct audience with the president, and it lasted long. They discussed everything. And yes, he brought a personal letter from Ayatollah Khamenei.
Yeah.
We don't know the detail. Nobody knows the details. No leaks whatsoever. But the letter was delivered by Arakshi. The signs that came from the Kremlin were immensely interesting by what they did not reveal. For instance, Peskov said, well, it depends on the Iranians. If they ask us anything, they ask us, we will consider. Very, very significant. At the same time, Trump was already pissed because instead of the Iranians talking to him, they were talking to Putin directly. Mm-hmm. And he started to spin a lie that almost simultaneously, according to one of his posts, Iran and Israel approached me for a ceasefire. That's a lie. Yeah. Israel begged him for a ceasefire. And this is not, everybody knows that this is exactly what happened. Because, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, they knew that they were getting eviscerated. Yeah. The key nodes of their economy and the revamped strategy by the IRGC was, we're going to paralyze their economy in 2 weeks, maximum 3, because they had started to use their really, really powerful missiles, the Khaibar, more Haji Qassems, more Fatah 1s, the ballistics, the hypersonics. So virtually at the same time, what we don't know in the chain of events, if there was, I would say, shadow play interaction between Washington and Moscow, with the Russians telling the Americans, look, maybe you have an off-ramp. The Iranians are going all the way. This is what they told us. The Israelis are begging you for a ceasefire. What if we talk to the Iranians? Take the ceasefire for now. So obviously, there's no way, Larry, no one can have this chain of events at 100%. But there might have been some sort of, let's say, subterranean channels, and this got to Trump. And what Trump did, true to character, was to jump on the opportunity and claim for himself the success of the partial ceasefire. So this scenario is quite plausible. And the fact that Putin said something yesterday that it's still ringing in my mind. He actually said, and it was quoted by TASS literally, the conflict between Israel and Iran is a thing of the past. Wow. But it's not. He knows that it's not. He knows that everybody knows that it's not. Like you said, this is bold, right? What makes him being so, he knows something that obviously we don't.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what happened between Monday and Tuesday early this week that led to the partial ceasefire, and what was exactly the Russian definitive contribution for the ceasefire, considering, as you correctly pointed out, that Iran was on the way to turn Israel into hell.
Let's come back to the letter that Arakci carried from the Ayatollah. So I've tried to. So I'm thinking, well, the letter could have said to Putin, "Screw off. We don't want to have any relationship with you." Okay. Exactly. I don't think that's what it said.
Definitely, that was the last thing will be on the letter, Larry. Yes.
I could only come up with 2 other options that he would could possibly include. One was, hey, you remember that mutual defense pact you offered us that we turned down? You know what? We thought about it some more, and I think that's a really good idea. And if it's still on the table, we'd like to get back into that. Or 3, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We've come to the conclusion that we've been completely betrayed by the IAEA. We've tried to play the Western game. We cooperate. We signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We allowed the inspectors, and as a result of that, we've been attacked. And there's not one word of condemnation from that. Therefore, we've taken the decision that we feel we have no alternative but to build a bomb.
Right. Larry, it's a mix of 2 and 3, but without the bomb. Okay, let's try to unwrap it. The strategic treaty that first was ratified by the Duma and then by the Majlis in Tehran, there was a gap of 2 months for the Majlis to ratify it. Big mistake. Why did they wait for so long? You know why? Because of the internal conflict in Tehran. And this internal conflict is extremely complicated because now it's not only 2 factions, there are 3. The first one, of course, the circle of Ayatollah Khamenei around himself and the circle, very close circle around him, including, remember that guy that the Israelis said that they killed?
Yeah.
He resurfaced on a public square in Tehran. And Ali Shamkhani is really top level. The second, and IRGC. Khamenei, the circle, IRGC. The second is the so-called reformists, Pezeshkian, but especially the brain behind all of that, even if he's not part of the government, Zarif. And the number 3 is secular nationalists that are not in favor of a theocratic democracy like the current system, but they are patriots.
Right.
So there is a clash at the level of the parliament and reaching, to the uppermost levels of power as well. So this explains, number one, why it took 2 months for the Majlis to ratify a very, very important treaty like that. And number two, which is something that Putin alluded to himself, saying, yes, the Persians are very proud, of course. We offered the full military relationship with them, and they declined. So this is a partial strategic partnership. It's not like the one they clinched with the DPRK, which is a full military treaty.
Right.
So obviously now Khamenei and the IRGC, they reconsidered everything. They said, maybe we should have a full military treaty. So I wonder if there's going to be some sort of addendum to what they signed and was ratified by both parliaments.
Yeah.
And of course, it's clear that Arakchi arrived in Moscow with a new shopping list. There's no question about that. And this is being, I wouldn't say it's being speculated in the Iranian media. Everything, Su-35s, more S-400s, you name it, long list. And this is what they need, essentially, because the western part of Iran, there are practically no air defenses.
Yeah.
And the terrible thing, which I'm sure you know all about this, Larry, it's basically drones coming from Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
So Iran has to review their relationship with Azerbaijan. Yesterday. It's very, very dangerous. It was not Israeli jets or Israeli missiles. It was drones launched from Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
So all this, evolving. And obviously, the relationship between Russia and Iran at a military level will be much, much closer now than it was a few weeks ago.
Well, in fact, Andrei Martyanov pointed out that there was one S-400 and one S-300 in Iran.
Right. Only one S-400 that we know. Andrei is right. Exactly.
It was at Bushehr. And
at Bushehr, exactly. Which, by the way, was attacked.
Yeah, I was going to say, did it get attacked? No.
No, in fact, it was not Bushehr itself. I think something landed beside Bushehr.
Yeah, there was an attack there's a military airfield about 7 miles away. That was attacked.
You're right.
The Bushehr power plant complex.
The Bushehr power plant was not attacked because it's protected, yes.
So, my thinking, again, I try to be practical about these things.
Yes.
If I was Iran, I'd immediately go to Russia and say, hey, we want you to have your personnel at every single one of our nuclear facilities, bring the S-400s to protect them, and put the U.S. on notice that any attack on those sites would be an attack on you.
This is what they should do, Larry. And probably coming from the IRGC, I would say they are seriously considering it. Yeah. Well, they learned their lessons the hardest way, man. Because the attacks on Iran, some of them were, and even today in Iranian media, they are recognizing that yes, some of the attacks were devastating, but we can recover. But for them, it's going to take much longer because they're alone. There's nobody helping them. Israel, the Americans can throw everything, the special cargo shipments, whatever. Iran, no, they have to start from scratch again, and not to mention the civilian installations.
Well, so is your take, do you think that Russia and China both appreciate that Iran is a critical chess piece? Now, because I've seen, I don't know if you saw the comment by John Helmer. I think it was completely off base, but he insisted that Putin was lying about having offered a defense pact to Iran.
Bullshit. I'm sorry. This is total bullshit. First of all, because this guy has no access to what really happens in Moscow. I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
The point is, which I keep emphasizing column after column, this is the hard note of BRICS. It's not India. I chose to call them the new Primakov triangle. RIC, instead of India, Iran. Because the three of them are very, very powerful civilization states. They don't hedge their bets, unlike India. They're not sitting on any fence. They don't want to be part of the Western system. They don't want to be a sub-colony of the US or of the West. Three of them, they are under sanctions. And three of them, as you know very well later, are considered existential threats to the US.
Yeah.
When you put this all together, these are the top three targets. There's no question about that. And of course, this is discussed in Moscow at the top think tank level, at the forums that you usually go when you come to Moscow, at the St. Petersburg forum last week. This is one of the key discussions. Russia has to pay really close attention to Iran because Russia is next.
Yeah.
They identified Iran as the weakest link. After Iran, if they destroy Iran, if they manage to fragment Iran, the next one will be Russia. They tried with Ukraine, it didn't work. They will try again. And of course, the third node, the Chinese, we were observing all this transfixed because, oh shit, if something happens to Iran, first of all, for us, is a national security problem because of all the energy they import. Second, that $400 billion deal, energy versus infrastructure, that they signed in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, a long time ago, keeps going. So these three BRICS, the new Primakov triangle, they know exactly all the machinations. There was an element, I would say, until this week, of Persian pride. This is something that we see when we visit Iran. They have to be proud of at least 2,500 years of civilization, diplomacy, art, culture, etc. They are a civilization state at this level, up there.
Right.
Of course, after 40 years of sanctions, they were weakened. Of course, you go to some no, many, like, in last month, can you believe it? I travel a lot in Iran, from the Caspian to the Persian Gulf, all the way to the Iran-Pakistani border. And when you see the infrastructure in many of these places, it's crumbling. Why? Because it was not renovated in over 40 years.
Yeah.
One of these, their port in the Caspian, wow, I thought it was in a very poor part of South America, for instance. There's practically no infrastructure. How can they have cargo ships coming from Astrakhan in Russia, crossing the Caspian, going to this port, and then going all the way to the Persian Gulf with that level of non-infrastructure? Impossible.
Mm-hmm.
No wonder the Russians, they want to build a railway marginal to the Caspian, because it will be cheaper and faster and better infrastructure instead of crossing the Caspian, and then you arrive at a port where there's nothing. So you see these kind of problems everywhere. No, non-upgraded infrastructure. But what our great friend Alistair Crook talks about, when he talks about resistance, Alistair is very much impressed with what he saw in Iran many years ago. Alistair went to Qom. He talked to Ayatollahs, so when you do something like that, you understand the theological aspect, and at the same time, you understand the substrata of this ethics of resistance. It's impossible to explain this to the West, Larry. Absolutely impossible.
Yeah. Well, the thing with Iran, it strikes me, is at least even prior to June 13th, there's still sort of this, and it existed in Russia too, this desire to be liked by the West, to have this, they want to have a relationship with the West. Yeah, and there's always
Larry. It's the people around the president. For instance, whenever I asked about Pezeshkian, I always had an extremely polite answer, but basically saying, yeah, he's too weak.
Yeah.
And obviously, the problem is he was elected, democratic elections. Now, I would say that most of the country is starting to understand he's not the right man for the historical moment. Raisi was.
Right.
Raisi was, wow, he was tough and knew the stakes. And he said, no, accommodation under their terms, no way. And that's the problem with Pezeshkian. He's still striving for some sort of accommodation. He believed in all the kabuki since the beginning of the negotiations. He only woke up the day that the nuclear installations were bombed.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote yesterday that if there's an official in Iran that somehow believes that they can have an accommodation with the West,
exactly,
they should be removed. They should be removed.
This means the current president and the people around him. That's complicated, and a lot of people in the Majlis. But you see, the Majlis is not. The parliament in Tehran is fascinating. I went in the past to some of the sessions. It's as lively as a parliament in the West. There's real debate. Did you see that they unanimously voted to block the Strait of Hormuz? Even the reformists, because they saw this as an attack on Iran, on national unity. And that's very, very important. This is one of the reasons for the so-called ceasefire. One of my old school deep state sources, Larry, I don't know if you know him. One day I'll throw you the name and you tell me if you know or not. He said that the CIA told Trump directly, look, the Chinese are terrified about the possible closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Of course they are, because their energy comes through the Strait of Hormuz. And this was one of the reasons why Trump decided to go ahead with the bombing, because he knew that the Iranians would later on say, okay, we're going to block the Strait of Hormuz. But the thing turned around when I'm not sure Trump, because he doesn't see the big picture. Some people around him told him, look, if they close the Strait of Hormuz, the global economy disappears in a few weeks, days or weeks. And then he started to have taco.
Yeah.
Then he went taco.
Actually, once I looked at the numbers, that 80% of the oil coming out of the Persian Gulf, coming through the Straits, goes to Asia. And I'm thinking, why is Iran going to take an action that's going to hurt Asia, where the Asians are supporting Iran? That doesn't make sense.
It would be a selective blockade. This is what they were discussing, Larry.
Yeah, selective blockade.
In this interval between the parliament voting, okay, let's block the Strait of Hormuz, and the final decision, which has to come from the Supreme Council and Khamenei himself. They were discussing, okay, maybe a selective blockade. Everything that will be shipped to Europe and the West, blocked.
Yeah.
Everything that is going to Russia, China, South Korea, whatever, no problem.
Yeah.
What the Yemenis were doing in the Bab al-Mandeb for months, and it worked. It was a selective blockade of the Red Sea.
Yeah, and that would make sense.
That would make sense, exactly. And as you know, Larry, the Persians are. It's a sign of a real culture and civilization. They are cool, calculating, very well informed. They take their time to make a big decision. You know, they analyze all angles. They're very good at designing scenarios and all that. They're very, very serious people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to say to follow that up. Notice the difference in civilian casualties inflicted by Iran and Israel, vice what Israel did in Iran.
Exactly.
I mean, it was like 36. A very small number, relatively for all of the missiles that went off throughout all Israel. Is less than 100 people were killed. Whereas, in Iran, the number was approaching 1,000, I think.
And they attacked civilian installations. They attacked civilian apartment buildings. They attacked the Iranian equivalent of the BBC, IRIB. We were there. That is the major building where you have all the major offices. They have an outstanding newsroom, an old school newsroom, 3 enormous connected rooms where they have newsrooms for all their local bulletins, provincial news, etc., international news, the big studios, etc. Can you imagine? It's the equivalent of bombing the BBC or France 2 here, France International, whatever, or Al Jazeera. It's the same thing. And they do it. Wow, come on. These people, they kill journalists, Larry. We know that. They killed 270-something journalists in Gaza. They kill doctors in hospitals, you know.
Well, and now I think the press contacts I did have on that, they've abandoned WhatsApp. And so they've recognized that WhatsApp is a compromised application.
Finally. Wow, can you believe that every time many of us, when we travel to West Asia, we see government officials using WhatsApp, and you have to explain to them, please don't do this. Same thing in Iran. A lot of people at governmental level in Iran, they were using WhatsApp until yesterday. It's absurd. It's totally absurd.
Yeah. So where do you think, Donald Trump's painted himself into a corner because he said,
yes,
oh, we've actually obliterated, destroyed all the uranium. They didn't take anything out. And yet I'm hearing through my sources that the intelligence community basically came to the intelligence community came to the conclusion, even before all this started, that Iran had removed the enriched uranium from those facilities.
Absolutely. 400 kilos.
Yeah.
And nobody knows where the uranium is now. Did you see Grossi, that pathetic Argentinian, totally bought at the head of IAEA? He's complaining out loud, we don't know where the uranium is now. And you never know, because now it's in a secret location. And basically the IAEA is going to be expelled from Iran.
Well, they should be. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of it practically. The only way I believe the only way Israel could target those nuclear scientists was with information they obtained from the IAEA.
They had inside information, exactly, from the inspectors, exactly.
Yeah. Now,
I can't believe that the Iranians were not paying attention to this. Once again, Larry, they were too naive, and they were expecting that the other side would play fair. They never.
Yeah. We signed the non-proliferation treaty. We're allowing the video cameras, 24/7 in our facilities. Hey, we're gonna get pat on the back. No, they got a kick in the balls.
Exactly. And now they're gonna exit the NPT. This is practically agreed. There's going to be a vote soon, and they would only rejoin the NPT if Israel joins the NPT, and we know this is not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, what do you make of what I've heard out of Moscow? Is Moscow was sort of saying, no, don't abandon the IAEA yet. Why is Moscow taking that line? You got any insights on that?
No, I don't, and I wonder why they would be saying that to Iran, considering how the IAEA acted, and now it's proven that there was spying going on, and Israel would never know exactly where some particular stuff was if inspectors had not inspected it on the spot. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, well, the Russian position is very complicated, Larry. It's very, very complicated. Everything that we learn, it's tidbits and nuggets of information, and especially inferring what we hear from Putin or from Peskov, sometimes from Medvedev when he's in his outbursts. Because, of course, and Putin mentioned that a few days ago, we have almost 1.5 million Russians and former Soviet citizens in Israel. Israel is practically a Russian country. You can interpret it any way you like, But what you can interpret it for sure is that obviously we cannot completely antagonize that genocidal system because we have a lot of double passport citizens living there, and they are Russian citizens as well. So this puts him in a very uncomfortable position. Very, very uncomfortable. And as we know, the Zionist lobby in Moscow is very strong as well. Yeah. And he has to compound with these people. This includes banking interests, some of the top oligarchs, it's an extremely touchy subject. And many of us, for instance, if we try to publish related to that in Russian media, they politely tells us, look, this maybe we can't. I understand their motives, but it's a pity because this should be public domain, not only inside Russia, but outside as well. And of course, from the point of view of Putin and the Security Council, they had to navigate all that. What they do know, even when they say, okay, it's not our war. Our war is here on our western borderlands. Correct. But now they know that war in West Asia is also their war. Because they have one of their strategic partners involved, and they know that the war is against BRICS as a whole. So now this is more than clear to the people who make the decisions in Moscow. So, and of course, the Chinese is also, it's so complicated. This morning, I was looking at Chinese reactions to the Chinese are very, analysts, I'm talking about think tanks and good top professors are some of the top Chinese universities. When you read what they're analyzing, they are very diffident of it. First of all, because they don't understand the Islamic Republic, how the system works. There are not many specialists in China. And the ones that do understand, they are Huis. They are Chinese Muslims. And there are not many of them. And they are not in Beijing. For instance, I met one of these guys in Yemen, Larry. He was from Ningxia province, which is very far away from Beijing. So this is a problem. There is a certain misinformation problem among Chinese, and this is one of their top allies and a matter of national security for them. So this is something that has to be worked short term and long term. And of course, the Chinese are concentrating on their own internal problems and their own possible false flag focus, which is time.
Yeah. Well, do you think, I'm pretty confident that I think Putin and his team understand that the war in Ukraine, the war in Iran, that this is all part of a broader strategy to preserve U.S. hegemony.
Of course.
So they're fighting really a global war. I'm not sure the Chinese grasp that yet.
No, they don't, Larry. They don't. And this is for instance, when I talk to my great friend, Professor Zhang Weiwei, it's interesting because some Chinese analysts, and I heard this from other Chinese analysts, he's too Maoist. And he's in favor of the system. I said, what the hell? He was a personal translator of Deng Xiaoping. How close to understanding the reforms of China can you be? Wow, come on. But there are some Chinese who they try to be maybe more, I don't know if they're trying to be more radical or less radical in the end. They don't understand this position. And Professor Zhang Weiwei understands pretty well that this is a war against all BRICS, China included. But when you read some scholars that are trying to be, let's say, more progressive or, with a little twist on the official explanations coming from the Politburo, okay, let's say slightly more independent, but they don't seem to get the big picture. How China is They only understand it geoeconomically, but not geopolitically. It's something that I noticed in Shanghai. Everybody understands that the Trump trade war was not against the global South, was against China from the beginning. Everybody understood that. But if you get into the geopolitical ramifications and the complexity of a war against BRICS, I'm not sure, as you said, I'm not sure they understand the ramifications.
Yeah. That now shifting a little bit to focus on Ukraine and NATO.
Did you see the NATO summit, Larry? Mine. So what was that?
All right. So we're the same age. So
yes.
Who originated the phrase "Who's your daddy"?
Who's your daddy?
It's a little bit of music trivia, and but there was a British group called the Zombies.
Of course, it's the Zombies who had "Time of the Season," which was one of the best hits of the late 60s.
Yeah. What's your name? Who's your daddy?
What's your name? Who's your daddy? In fact, this is a verse of "Time of the Season," Larry. Now I was looking, which song was this? Obviously, what's your name? Who's your daddy? Well, I had the single. I used to play the single all the time. Excellent.
I have never seen such a humiliating display.
Yes.
I mean, this is reminiscent of something like out of China where they invented kowtowing.
Yes. But that guy is pathetic, Larry. Everybody hates Tutti Frutti in Holland. He's considered one of the worst, if not the worst, Dutch prime minister ever. What do they do with these people? They kick them up to some international organizations, like they did with Stoltenberg in Norway. Same thing they did with Rutte in Holland. Same thing. But the most important thing is, I try to put it in 5 seconds, in fact. Okay, what did they decide at The Hague? We will continue to be at war with Russia, and soon we'll also be at war with China. These were the decisions.
Yeah.
At the Hague. And of course, the 5%. The 5%.
Well, we saw the shift. I guess you would mark yesterday as the shift in the Russian policy towards the EU and Ukraine's role, with both Medvedev and then Lavrov coming out and basically saying, "Now, we used to say that Ukraine could go and become a member of the EU, no problem. Now it's a problem."
No, it's a problem because they understand, Larry, that the EU and NATO is the same thing. The EU is a sort of PR arm of NATO.
Yeah.
The EU is not an independent institution, not to mention the EC, the European Commission, the policy arm of the EU, which is, wow. This is a warmongering organization, completely anti-Russian in every aspect.
Yeah, and what is driving it? Because I could understand at the end of World War II, and with the Soviets continued to occupy, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc., and Germany, that then the animus of the Europeans made, you could explain it. But what explains it now? This is what's so crazy.
Well, the people who are in control of the machinery in Brussels. Not only the institutions of the EU, but especially the European Commission, led by that toxic Medusa. All of us, we know her name, right? And of course, giving too much power to the Baltic Chihuahuas, to Poland, and to Finland.
Mm-hmm.
Finland, Poland, and the Baltic Chihuahuas, they think that they can start a war against Russia tomorrow. They probably have 2 tanks and 1 ship, and they think they can destroy a nuclear superpower. But really, I'm not making that up. This is the way they think. If you listen to that batshit crazy Estonian, which is only there because von der Leyen lobbied everybody in Brussels to get her as representative of 450 million citizens' foreign policy. This is, I think, in terms of a Kafkaesque absurdity, this beats anything else. Pay attention to everything that she says is never related to a foreign policy understanding of how the EU should position itself in the wider world. It's a Russophobic remark.
Yeah.
Anything she says, anything. Of course, there is already, there are people in Brussels who are pissed. We have to throw this idiot out, but how? There are no mechanisms for that. Because, unelected, you name it. It's a closed Kafkaesque system,
I don't think people appreciate how small Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia are. Each one of them has fewer people than the borough of Queens in New York City.
Exactly. Exactly. They are literally neighborhoods. Yeah.
No, it's not big. How did you come away with your last visit in Moscow in terms of sensing the Russian attitude with the pace of the war now in Ukraine? It seems that it's accelerating, and they definitely can say, hey, light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely. Well, this month in Moscow was great. It was not only Moscow, because I was at 3 forums back to back. In Nizhny Novgorod, it was a digital forum. It was very, very interesting because we were discussing fake news and the rule of artificial intelligence in depth. Then the next week was the forum in Moscow, where the so-called Forum of the Future, which was I won't get into details. But anyway, this is where Elon Musk was the big superstar.
Right.
And that was quite something, Larry. In fact, they should have invited you for this. I know you were there.
I was there. Yeah, I was there.
You were there. Okay, no, I'm mixing it all up. It's a mess. Yeah.
So I wasn't at St. Petersburg, though.
Exactly. But the thing about this forum is I heard some, I would say, extremely dodgy things about the role of Peter Thiel and the former PayPal mafia, and some Russians want to start bringing them closer to Russia, which I think is a terrifying prospect for Russia. But you were there. You saw that as well.
Yeah.
But last week was the real deal, because we had some of the round tables in St. Petersburg. They were absolutely outstanding. There was a Russia-US round table. It was packed. The problem is the Americans who have been living in Russia for a long time. There were no new Americans that flew in for the panel.
Yeah.
There was a Russia-China roundtable, that one was also packed. And then we saw a lot of Chinese businessmen who want to do more business in Russia, and provincial governors, heads of state companies discussing Chinese investment in Russia. That was immensely interesting. There was another one on the Arctic Silk Road, which they call the North and Sea Route. This was my favorite, because I got numbers and details about the progress on setting up this connectivity corridor, which obviously the Americans are freaking out, because it will be a very viable alternative to the Suez Canal.
Mm-hmm.
Side by side with the international North-South transport corridor, Russia, Iran, India. By the way, another element of the war, Larry, the Russians cannot allow Iran to be mortally wounded, because they are betting a lot on the transportation corridor.
Yeah.
This is immensely important, and both Russia and Iran, they know about it, and also the Indians know about it. And the Indians, of course, they sat on the fence on the war. You noticed on the Iran-Israel. I didn't like that at all. But I think for all of us who are following this closely, it spoke volumes, the Indian reaction. And people inside BRICS, they didn't like it. They didn't like it at all. Well, okay, and we were in St. Petersburg. And of course, at the end, we had the plenary session where the Global South was on stage. You had Putin, Vice President of China, President of Indonesia, Prabowo, guest of honor, a guy from Bahrain, head of security, and the Vice President of South Africa on stage with Putin. That was this. Okay, this is the Global South, and the Global South is here.
Right.
It was an immense statement. So St. Petersburg was very, very important. And of course, there were discussions on BRICS, SCO, ASEAN, everything. And it was a preamble to what happened these past 2 days, which I'm sure people in America have no idea about. There was a meeting of the defense ministers of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. All of them. Yeah. You know what we had side by side? The defense ministers of, among others, India, Pakistan, and Iran on the same table. This is intense. And we heard from the Iranians that, yes, when they met with the Chinese, they had a shopping list, Larry, including the J-10C fighters. They want to buy Chinese fighters. Of course, they need them. So this was very, very important. And yesterday and today, the meeting of the Eurasian Economic Union with Putin in person in Minsk, very, very important. And they have deals of economic deals with a lot of places that are not in Eurasia, including Cuba. So you see the whole thing expanding little by little. All these multilateral organizations with Eurasia as the main focus, of course, because go back to Mackinder, is the center of the world, and they are expanding all over. And obviously, the West, they have no clue what they're doing.
Well, let me on the trust level. Do you think, has there been any damage done to the relationship, let's say, between Putin and Trump in light of what happened in Iran? Because if I'm looking at it as a Russian intelligence officer, I now realize that attempt to kill Putin in Kursk with drones, followed by the drone attacks on the strategic air bases, using just days before there's supposed to be these negotiations taking place in Istanbul, then that whole sort of model was repeated in Iran. And then all of a sudden at that point, you got to realize these just don't appear similar. This is part of a broader plan. I can't trust Donald Trump. That's how I'd come at it.
You're absolutely right. But it goes beyond Donald Trump, probably, Larry. They cannot trust anything coming out from Israel. But they already knew that. Because the modus operandi, the attack on the strategic bombers and the attack in Iran is Mossad-esque.
Yes,
as we know very well. So this was most certainly a Mossad playbook on both instances, and Trump may or may have not known about it, depending on what the people around him are feeding him. Of course, they are feeding him misinformation. That amplifies the problem because, as you know very well, Larry, he doesn't read anything.
Yeah.
So he can be easily fooled. It's so easy to fool the president of the United States. Well, the previous one was another story because it was a cadaver. This guy, apparently he thinks, he makes decisions, but he's surrounded by sycophants or people who feed him misinformation. And on top of it, he doesn't make the effort to at least read a few reports or even pay attention to some sources of information, real sources of information.
Yeah, well, his rejection of the intelligence community's position. Now, I'm not here to argue that the intelligence community is perfect or always make. I've seen how the sausage is made, but the judgment that they had reached regarding the presence of nuclear weapons in Iran was predicated primarily, I believe, on not only what the IAEA information, but that either the CIA had penetrated that or a third party like Israel had penetrated it, or the French. So they had both sort of the official IAEA, and then you had the classified material coming out from that.
Exactly.
And so they knew. And I guarantee you that now, if they had to come together to make a judgment, I think they would be inclined to say, we don't know.
We don't know. Yeah.
Because John Mearsheimer's made the case, and I could see the Iranians saying, "Hey, we've cooperated, we've played along, and all we've gotten is attacked. So the only way we can be safe is to have a nuke." I could see those. There are those, I'm sure, in the society, in the military, making that case.
Yes, the IRGC seems to be leaning this way. The problem is the ultimate decision comes from Khamenei, and the precedent fatwas. The first one by Khomeini, and the second one by Khamenei himself, that nuclear weapons are anti-Islam. He will have to revert his own fatwa, and this, in Shiite theological terms, it's a nightmare. He would have to find a way to do it. For the moment, this is where we are. At the same time, the RGC is saying, look, we proved that our ballistic missile program is impeccable. And we are developing even more. We don't need our deterrence in terms of our ballistic missile industry is more than enough. We were on our way. That's the beginning of our conversation. We were on our way to flatten Israel.
Oh, yeah.
Another 2 or 3 weeks. We don't need nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that their research on ballistic missiles will, it's up several notches after that. And they proved that they have very, very good hardware. No question about that. But the theological aspect is very complex in Iran. And I'm sure Khamenei wouldn't like to make a decision like this that reverts everything they had been preaching for decades, even more than that, in terms of nuclear weapon, the concept of a nuclear weapon. But they have a plan B. Their plan B is their ballistic. Why the Americans are so obsessed into eliminating the ballistic missile program in Iran? I remember the JCPOA in Vienna in 2015. I was there for Asia Times at the time, and we had briefings from the Iranian delegation. One of them was by Zarif himself. He spent 3 hours with us. And the main theme was, look, this is not going to work because the Americans want to introduce our ballistic missile program in the negotiation. And Zarif was basically saying, we're walking out. And then John Kerry called Washington and said, look, they're going to walk out. We have to concentrate on the nuclear program. And that's when they finally clinched the deal.
Yeah, well, that's where they're going to come back. I want just to note what Iran did not attack in Israel.
Yes,
they didn't go after the water supply.
True.
Because I think they recognize that, one, that would be an attack on civilians, and two, it would also prevent Palestinians from getting fresh water as well.
True,
exactly. But again, it shows how
occupation is humanitarian always. Exactly.
Yeah. So they were very thoughtful in the nature of their attacks. That's what I don't think the West picks up on.
And this, Larry, it's impossible to explain to the West. This is tied up with Shiite theology. Mm-hmm. If you don't understand how Shiite theology is community spirit and humanitarian frame of mind, you don't understand the Islamic Republic.
Yeah,
of course, and this implies not attacking civilians, even in the middle of a hot war, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah,
the genocidals in Tel Aviv, they don't have this kind of problem because for them, all of us are Amalek, right?
Yeah,
all of us.
And that's the problem.
And that's the problem. Yes.
All right, my friend. Listen, I've taken up enough of your time. I always appreciate
right now, just after this, 12-day war where they're hit pretty hard with these Iranian missiles?
Well, it was extremely costly. I mean, just if you look at like the expenditure of munitions, both the missiles that they fired, the aircraft that they had to keep running and keep in operation, almost continually, and then the air defense interceptors. It comes out to many hundreds of millions of dollars a day. I thought, I see different figures. I think the other day I just saw one 200 million for the interceptors every day, and then but a larger number actually for the offensive part of the operation, and it comes close to $1 billion, like over $500 million a day. And for a small country like Israel, if it was just Israel, they could not keep that up, for very long at all. They don't have that capacity. Now, of course, they're being supported by the U.S., but that's still, even for the U.S. Well, okay, the U.S. can keep on printing money, right? But at least for the time being, but they only have so many interceptors. They only have so many munitions. We understand that. So it was very costly in just pure military terms. But then also there were strikes on the port, and which led to closing, not the entire closing down of the port in Haifa, but the major shipping line, Maersk, suspended its operations there, and then of course the airport was largely shut down throughout. So its links to the world which had already, there's the port on the Red Sea that was shut down a long time ago because of the efforts of the Houthis, and is still not in operation. So this was a country that was, not entirely isolated, but which only has a few links, transportation links with the rest of the world, and these had been severely compromised by the attack. And then you had attacks on like oil refineries that actually led to power outages and rolling blackouts. And these were, again, just sort of, it was just a taste of what I think Iran could, the blows that Iran could deal Israel. I don't know if anybody has actually totaled up the total economic damage. There were also, I think the Microsoft headquarters was hit, the Weizmann Institute, like the leading scientific research institution there in Israel, was hit and very severely damaged. I think it's probably just going to have to be entirely rebuilt. And all these things, this is all part, these kinds of institutions are are part of Israel's advanced economic sector. It's part of the economic engine that keeps that allows Israel to prosper. And these all have been damaged, and they have to affect the calculations again of major corporations and into the future. They're going to have to reassess the extent of their investment in Israel. It's hard to believe that they're going to maintain the current levels. That I think almost certainly they're going to scale back. So there was immediate damage, and I think, again, as we've said before, there's certainly long-term damage. There's just the confidence that countries had, or corporations had in Israel. That was shaken prior to this recent war. Ever since October 7th, they just began to understand, Israel's not the kind of country that we thought it was. And then, this shows that not only that, it's actually vulnerable to attack. We kind of assumed that it was always invincible. It always, dealt these devastating blows to its neighbors, but it never suffered any of these blows itself. And so this is Israel has ceased to be the country that it used to be. In the minds of many people, including investors and other political leaders around the world.
Right. I'm just wondering how easy it will be for them to rebuild the structures that were destroyed, because who wants to invest in rebuilding the structure that may easily become the target again? There's a reason that these buildings were destroyed to begin with. These institutions that are pillars of Israeli society, like the Weizgarber Institute and, the ports, all this stuff. It's like, okay, they're badly damaged. We were talking about this current state as just a pause. This war is likely going to resume again. You're in the middle of construction, and then another ballistic missile is probably going to hit it, right? So who wants to fund that? Who wants to keep it going? I imagine the willingness to rebuild in Israel has got to be not that high if they're thinking about that. Just like we're spending all this time and money to rebuild something that could potentially just be shot again if this war starts up, and everybody thinks it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's, this is a sort of, this kind of reputational damage is damage that really cannot be repaired in the short or medium term. I mean, it's going to take many years, if not, decades to really repair it, to get people back to the place that they were before October 7th. Israel is a society here to stay. It's normal, it's healthy, it's stable. Everything that's happened now tells you, no, it's not stable. It's not really secure, and it's not normal. And there will be people who, again, like corporate leaders, whatever they may be, they have their ideological side to them, but in the end, it's the bottom line. And you say, am I really going to risk, $1 billion in this country? I don't think so.
Right. Would you say then that it's fair to say that the world has fundamentally changed since this 12-day war? That it is something comparable to like October 7th or Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Are we in, or is this kind of like step 2 after October 7th?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's part of it's a continuation of the trends that we've already seen. But I think one difference is Iran. I think the perception of Iran has changed, and for the better. Iran has been subject to, this slanderous propaganda campaign for decades and decades, and it really has affected perceptions of the country, from all around the world, even within the global South. And I think actually Iran's conduct during this war, they clearly were the victim. And they didn't collapse. They reconstituted themselves. They fought back and did real damage to the enemy. And I think that has changed the perception of Iran throughout the world, and maybe most importantly within the Middle East. There are these sectarian tendencies that we saw play out, for example, in Syria, the Sunnis versus the Shia, and of course the Iranians are Shia. And so there are segments of these societies that are very suspicious of Iran. But I think just seeing Iran, fight back, first be subject to this attack, really suffering under as a result of the Israeli surprise attack, and then inflicting real damage, has got to change their perceptions to an important degree. Say, okay, yeah, these people are for real. They really do oppose the Zionists. Sometimes you found, I'd hear of propaganda. It's like, the Iranians are just phonies. They're not really opposed to Zionists. I think that was always ridiculous. But now that line is which is propagated often by Sunni extremists, is really lost a lot of strength. Again, I'm just providing one example within the region, but in general, the perception of Iran has changed. And I think Iran's relationship, another important outcome was that their relationship, we'll see how it develops, but their relationship with Russia and China has got to change. I think that they, assuming that they're reasonable people, they have to understand that they've already improved relations tremendously with these countries, but they have to go much further, to withstand the next wave of attacks. They need the help of Russia and China. So that will just further intensify again a trend that already existed, towards a kind of a quasi-alliance between these three countries. I think that's just going to go stronger as a result of this.
Are you expecting to see some type of mutual defense pact between countries like Russia and Iran, or China and Iran, in the coming, days or weeks before, the war starts back up again? And if that does, then that could just potentially put a cap on it and be like, well, okay, no more, because China and Russia will get involved.
Right. I don't expect that. I think countries are usually reluctant to, it's not exactly in the middle of a war, but it's It almost is. I think it's a lull within a war, and I think countries are reluctant to make those kind of alliances in these kind of circumstances because, yeah, you really are asking for trouble. If you can do it during peacetime, and then and before the war breaks out, you can prevent war. But war has already begun essentially, so I don't think that that's going to happen. But they clearly can do a lot to bolster Iran's defenses and its offensive capabilities. And I assume, and also to help them with intelligence, maybe that was the major failure on the Iranian side, was the deep penetration of Iranian society and government by Mossad and to a certain extent probably by the CIA as well. And that's something they've had obviously some success in uprooting that network, but I'm sure they need to do more. That's a weakness that has to be rectified, and I think they would be foolish not to look for help from the Russians and the Chinese on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of interesting how these other big powers like Russia and China, they don't have something that's counter to really NATO. NATO is the only organization in the world that is this alliance that's constantly expanding. They like, hey, join our club. Whereas, we always accuse Russia and China of being expansionists or they're imperialist powers, but they don't have anything like this. It seems very difficult to try to get join their club, be under a military umbrella. They just say, no, we protect our country. That's it. It seems very difficult to sort of form these alliances, whereas the United States is the opposite. If you don't join our club, we'll regime change you and make you join our club. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and I think it's becoming clear that actually this expansionist NATO doesn't make NATO strong. It actually gives you more liabilities. That NATO all of a sudden has to absorb all the potential conflicts that these smaller countries are involved in, and so is that why maybe Russia and China are reluctant to ever create something like NATO? We had the Warsaw Pact, that's over. There seems to be no desire to do something like that again.
Right. I think they understand that the Warsaw Pact was actually a huge burden for the Soviet Union, for Russia. Back then the Soviet Union. And they don't want to repeat that mistake. I think that's a part of it. There's no question about it. But then also there is this, what they've said openly, I think both the Chinese and Russia, is that we don't want to engage in bloc politics. We don't want to divide the world into blocs. We believe in kind of an open world. That's what BRICS is all about, this multipolar world. That's their vision. And I think they sincerely believe in that. So there is this reluctance to create, a counter NATO. The thing is that NATO itself has a say in that. It's just like you don't want to have an enemy. You don't want to have the world divided. But if NATO insists on seeing you as the enemy and acting accordingly, you just may not have a choice. And I think that's what they're finding. I mean, China in particular was very, very reluctant to be drawn into this, but the continuing, the incessant hostility from the U.S. to China, and and all these very hostile measures that have been taken against China, has convinced China that they don't have a choice but to strengthen, to draw closer to countries like Iran and Russia. And it seems amazing to me. I think Iran understood that quite a long time ago. I think it was back around 2010 when Medvedev was president of Russia. The Russians had signed an agreement with Iran to provide them with S-300, air defense systems. But then they started to delay. And why was that? Is because pressure from the West, and Medvedev back then was not the Medvedev that we know and love now. He bowed to that pressure. He wanted to maintain good relations with the U.S. And then, they saw in the end, it made no difference. You actually do make these concessions, you accommodate, them, you try to demonstrate that it's reasonable, but there's just this unrelenting hostility. And so they learned their lesson. The Russians did. They learned it the hard way. But now they came to they went to the Iranians and said, here we can provide you with a really effective air defense system. And the Iranians refused, because the Iranians under Pezeshkian, I don't think this would have been true under the previous President Raisi, but under Pezeshkian, apparently this is what reports say. It seems incredible to me, but we've heard similar things about Pezeshkians in reference to other issues. Was hoping to reach out to the West to show they're reasonable, show that they were open to a reestablishment of normal relations. In other words, a normalization of relations, and very foolishly rejected this offer. That, by the way, recent events make me think that that helicopter crash that killed Raisi, may not have been just an accident. It's not so much because, Pezeshkian became president afterwards. I don't know that anybody really knew that he would be the president and that he would make these foolish decisions. But just that you saw the penetration of Iran, it was exposed by this Operation Rising Lion. We became aware of it. So that makes you think that maybe it extended to some people associated with that helicopter flight. Anyway, that's just a thought. We'll probably never know for sure, but that's just a thought right there.
Qatar has exposed Donald Trump's lies on the ceasefire between Iran and Israel. And why are we not surprised? Remember how often Trump has repeatedly claimed that both Iran and Israel had reached out to him seeking his intervention to achieve a ceasefire? Now, of all the countries, Qatar, a close ally of the USA, has come out in the open to bust his lies. If anything, the statement by an advisor to the Qatari Prime Minister suggests that it was the missile attack on the US military base in Qatar by Iran that forced Trump to immediately think of a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Israeli terrorists have continued to slaughter more innocent Palestinians, mainly children in Gaza. Now let's look at these two key developments from the Middle East in detail. Remember Trump's repeated claims that both Iran and Israel had approached him since they were tired of fighting? He also kept saying that the US strikes on 3 key Iranian nuclear facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan were what had forced the Iranians to agree for a ceasefire. He made this astonishing claim as recently as last week, only a few days ago, when he was visiting the Netherlands for the NATO summit.
And they're both tired, exhausted. They fought very, very hard and very viciously, very violently. And they were both satisfied to go home and get out. And can it start again? I guess someday it can. It could maybe start soon. I think a big telltale sign was when, as you know, Iran somewhat, by not much, violated the ceasefire, and Israel had the planes going out that morning, and there were a lot of them, 52 of them. And I said, you got to get them back. And they brought them back. They didn't do anything. They brought them back. It was very good. I thought it was amazing. Well, maybe they were hit, but it wasn't bad. Well, it was so bad that they ended the war. It ended the war. Somebody said in a certain way, that it was so devastating, actually. If you look at Hiroshima, if you look at Nagasaki, that ended a war too. This ended a war in a different way, but it was so devastating.
But according to Al Jazeera, the government-owned media platform in Qatar, an advisor to Qatar's Prime Minister and spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Majid bin Mohammed Al Ansari, has told the channel that it was Trump who had requested the Qatari Prime Minister for a ceasefire. Al Ansari said that after Iran attacked the US airbase in Qatar on Monday last week, Trump called the Qatari Prime Minister and said a deal might be imminent. I'm going to play the clip for you. This man is no ordinary person. As I said, he's an advisor to the Qatari Prime Minister and the spokesperson for the Ministry of External Affairs. He is saying that immediately after Iran stunned everyone with a missile attack on the US airbase in Qatar, Trump was on the phone with the Qatari Prime Minister talking about the ceasefire.
Last week was there was a very difficult day for Qatar. It's the first time in our history to receive such an attack from an external power. We have seen 19 missiles target a Qatari base, which is a Udeid base housing U.S. forces in Qatar. And we are very thankful and very proud of our military, where multiple Qatari Patriot units across 2 different sites were able to down all but one of these missiles, which resulted in no injuries and no property damage almost at all. And that moment is the moment when we got the call from President Trump that a deal might be imminent and that a ceasefire might be possible with Israel. And it was requested of Qatar by President Trump in his call to His Highness to start the process on finalizing between both sides how we can reach an agreement. And this is when our Prime Minister immediately, right after the attack, the minute the attack ended, the Prime Minister went on calls with the VP of the United States, J.D. Vance, and we had calls with the Iranian side as well, including the call between His Highness and the Iranian president right the next day. And we were able throughout that night, that very difficult night for us here in Qatar, to bring about the ceasefire that is in place right now. And as I said, now the momentum created by this ceasefire is something we want to build up on to reach a more sustainable peace in the region.
Nowhere does this key Qatari official say that Iran was desperate for a ceasefire because B-2 bombers from the US had destroyed its nuclear facilities. That's what Trump has been saying to all of us for so many days. Even Trump supporters and former American diplomats had gone public to announce that Trump was desperate to achieve a ceasefire because he didn't want Israel to receive any more battering from Iran. Steve Bannon, a former top strategist of Trump, was one of them.
Yesterday, they took this ceasefire was as much to save Israel. That's the hidden story here. They bit off way more than they could chew.
But it seems Trump was simply too scared by the prospect of Iranian missiles targeting other US military bases in the region. This latest revelation clearly shows that lying and making false claims have become a hallmark of the US president's personality. Whilst we have been busy covering the Iran-Israel conflict, Israeli terrorists have continued to slaughter more innocent Palestinians. They include men, women, children, and babies. Even though Trump told us yesterday that a ceasefire could be expected in Gaza within a week, this hasn't deterred evil Israelis from killing children and babies for fun. In its latest act of barbarism, Israeli terrorists launched air attacks on the Al-Tufa neighborhoods in Gaza City, killing at least 20 people, including 9 children. The videos of this genocidal act is so disturbing that I couldn't upload them even on our Telegram channel. Imagine, I couldn't muster the courage to see those children and babies being carried by Palestinian rescue workers. But Israeli terrorists slaughtered these angels without any hesitation or guilt. You wouldn't find a more barbaric and pure evil people than these Israelis. They would go down in history as the most heartless, soulless, depraved, and deranged people. Thanks to bloodthirsty terrorist Benjamin Netanyahu, Gaza is now grappling with a different problem altogether, the rise of gang wars within Palestinians. This was after a pro-Israeli gang in South Gaza recently raided the Nasser hospital, the last functioning hospital in the region, and caused widespread carnage. Members of this outfit, which is called Abu Shabab Armed Gang, later took pride in causing destruction in the hospital and setting cars on fire before kidnapping many people from the hospital premises. War criminal Netanyahu, wanted by the International Criminal Court, recently admitted. He admitted supplying lethal weapons to this armed gang. Clearly, The aim is to push Gaza into a never-ending anarchy. And if this is not enough, Trump and Netanyahu are also facing condemnation for mixing food materials such as flour meant for starving Palestinians with narcotic pills. The plan is clear. Those who manage to survive the Holocaust must not be able to live a normal and healthy life. And the Palestinians will be suffering the after effects of the Israeli and US atrocities for generations to come. Elsewhere, Israeli terrorists on Saturday blew up a Palestinian home in the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. This came amidst several reports of more Israeli atrocities and stealing of Palestinian land in the occupied West Bank. This is happening with the blessing of Trump and, more importantly, the US taxpayers' money. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform. And
Coffee. Follow me.